The foundations of the Trojan War were laid not in the halls of mortal kings, but in the ethereal realm of the gods themselves, where divine pride and cosmic jealousy would ultimately condemn an entire civilization to destruction. The chain of events that would lead to 10 years of brutal warfare began with what should have been the most joyous of occasions, a wedding celebration that would become the catalyst for the greatest conflict of the ancient world. Peleus, king of the Myrmidons in Thessaly, was about to marry Thetis, the sea nymph whose beauty had captivated both Zeus and Poseidon. However, when the fates revealed that Thetis would bear a son destined to surpass his father in greatness, the gods quickly arranged her marriage to a mortal to prevent any threat to their supremacy. The wedding feast on Mount Pelion drew all the major deities of Olympus, who came bearing gifts and celebrating the union that would eventually produce Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation. Yet one goddess remained conspicuously absent from the guest list. Eris, the personification of strife and discord, had been deliberately excluded from the festivities. The other gods, perhaps foolishly, believed that a celebration of love and unity required no place for the harbinger of chaos. This slight would prove to be one of the most catastrophic oversights in divine history. Eris, burning with resentment at her exclusion, devised a revenge that would echo through the ages. The goddess of discord arrived uninvited at the wedding feast, her dark robes contrasting sharply with the golden light that illuminated the divine assembly. Without announcement or ceremony, she hurled a golden apple into the midst of the celebrating deities. The fruit, crafted from pure celestial gold and inscribed with the seemingly simple words "to the fairest," rolled across the marble floor and came to rest before 3 of Olympus's most powerful goddesses: Hera, queen of the gods and protector of marriage; Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; and Aphrodite, the embodiment of love and beauty. Each goddess immediately claimed the apple as rightfully hers. Hera, as Zeus's wife and the queen of Olympus, argued that her position alone made her the most deserving. Athena contended that true beauty lay in wisdom and intellectual prowess, qualities she possessed in abundance. Aphrodite simply smiled, confident that her domain over love and physical beauty made the apple's destination obvious. The dispute quickly escalated beyond mere words, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of Olympus itself. Zeus, recognizing the impossible position he would face if forced to choose between his wife, daughter, and the goddess who had aided him in numerous endeavours, refused to judge the contest. Instead, he declared that the decision should be made by a mortal, someone removed from the complex web of divine politics and relationships. The choice fell upon Paris, also known as Alexandros, a young shepherd tending his flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida near Troy. Paris was no ordinary shepherd. Born as the second son of King Priam of Troy and Queen Hecuba, his birth had been accompanied by a prophecy so dire that it sealed his fate before he had drawn his first breath. Hecuba had dreamed that she would give birth to a flaming torch that would consume all of Troy, and the seer Aesicus interpreted this vision as a warning that the child would bring destruction upon the city. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, blessed with the gift of prophecy but cursed so that her predictions would never be believed, also foresaw the catastrophe that Paris would unleash. Determined to prevent this prophesied doom, Priam ordered the infant Paris to be exposed on Mount Ida, left to die from exposure or wild animals. However, the child was discovered and raised by Agelaus, the chief herdsman of the royal flocks, who found the baby being suckled by a she-bear. Paris grew to manhood, unaware of his royal heritage, living the simple life of a shepherd while possessing the natural nobility and striking handsomeness that marked him as no common peasant. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris on Mount Ida in all their divine splendour, each determined to claim the golden apple through persuasion rather than force. The young shepherd, overwhelmed by their presence, initially attempted to divide the apple equally among them or suggest they share the honour. The goddesses, however, demanded a single victor, and each began to offer bribes that would tempt any mortal man. Hera, regal and imposing in her golden robes and crowned with a diadem that caught the sunlight, offered Paris dominion over all of Asia and Europe. She promised him power beyond imagination, the ability to rule vast territories and command armies that would make him the greatest king in mortal history. Her offer was one of political supremacy, the chance to reshape the world according to his will. Athena, appearing in her gleaming armour with her owl perched upon her shoulder and her grey eyes flashing with intelligence, offered wisdom and victory in all battles. She promised to make him the greatest warrior and strategist who ever lived, capable of conquering any enemy through superior tactics and divine guidance. Her gift was that of military excellence and intellectual superiority that would ensure his name lived forever in the annals of heroic achievement. Aphrodite approached with a different strategy entirely. The goddess of love appeared in a diaphanous gown that seemed woven from sea foam and starlight, her golden hair flowing freely and her smile promising pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. She offered Paris the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, whose beauty was so legendary that men spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones across the Mediterranean. The choice that Paris faced was fundamentally one between power, glory and love. Each offer represented a different path his life could take, and each goddess watched intently as the young shepherd weighed their proposals. The decision would not only determine his personal fate, but would set in motion the events that would fulfill the very prophecy his parents had tried so desperately to prevent. Paris, swayed by youth and desire rather than wisdom or ambition, awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. The goddess of love smiled triumphantly as she accepted her prize, while Hera and Athena departed in cold fury, their faces set with the promise of terrible retribution against both Paris and his city. From that moment, Troy gained two implacable divine enemies whose wrath would prove instrumental in the city's eventual destruction. The ramifications of this divine beauty contest extended far beyond the personal grievances of spurned goddesses. The judgment of Paris occurred against a backdrop of growing tensions between the established powers of the Bronze Age world. The Mycenaean Greek kingdoms centred on powerful citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos and Sparta had been expanding their influence throughout the Aegean for generations. These warrior kingdoms, ruled by ambitious kings who combined military prowess with shrewd political acumen, were constantly seeking new sources of wealth and strategic advantage. Troy, positioned at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, controlled one of the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world. Ships carrying goods between Europe and Asia, including precious metals, luxury items, and essential commodities like grain, had to pass through the narrow waterway that Troy commanded. The city's wealth derived not only from trade duties and port fees, but also from its ability to grant or deny passage to merchant vessels, giving it enormous economic leverage over the entire region. King Priam had transformed Troy into a magnificent city whose walls and towers were renowned throughout the known world. The Trojans had grown wealthy and powerful through their control of maritime trade, developing a sophisticated urban culture that rivaled anything in Greece. However, this prosperity inevitably attracted the attention of the Mycenaean kingdoms, who viewed Troy's strategic position with a mixture of envy and concern. The economic motivations for conflict were compounded by the complex web of alliances and obligations that bound the various Greek kingdoms together. The Mycenaean political system was based on reciprocal relationships between kings who owed each other military support in times of need. When one ruler called for assistance, his allies were honour-bound to respond with ships and warriors, creating the potential for small disputes to escalate into major conflicts involving multiple kingdoms. The prophecies surrounding Paris were not the only divine warnings that cast shadows over Troy's future. The city's fate had been sealed by the gods long before the shepherd prince made his fateful choice on Mount Ida. Apollo and Poseidon, having been forced to serve King Laomedon as punishment for rebelling against Zeus, had built Troy's magnificent walls. However, when Laomedon refused to pay them the agreed-upon wages, both gods swore that the city they had created would eventually fall to Greek armies. These divine curses created an atmosphere of inevitable doom that permeated Trojan society, despite the city's apparent strength and prosperity. The oracles and seers who served the royal court repeatedly warned of approaching catastrophe, though their prophecies were often dismissed or misinterpreted by those who heard them. Cassandra's gift of prophecy, rendered useless by Apollo's curse that no one would believe her warnings, meant that Troy's most accurate prophet was also its most ignored. The attempts to prevent the fulfillment of these prophecies only served to ensure their eventual realization. Priam's decision to expose Paris as an infant was motivated by a desperate desire to protect his city, yet the prince's survival and eventual return to Troy would bring about precisely the destruction his parents had tried to prevent. Similarly, the various efforts to interpret and circumvent other prophetic warnings would prove futile against the inexorable march of fate. As Paris prepared to claim Aphrodite's promised reward, the stage was set for a conflict that would consume an entire generation and reshape the political landscape of the ancient world. The divine discord sown by Eris's golden apple had taken root in both mortal and immortal realms, creating the conditions for a war that would test the limits of human endurance and divine intervention. The golden apple had been awarded, and Aphrodite's triumph would soon manifest itself in the mortal world through events that would transform a shepherd's romantic pursuit into the greatest military conflict of the Bronze Age. Paris, still unaware of his true parentage, would soon discover that claiming the goddess's promised reward would require him to abandon his pastoral life and embrace a destiny that had been foretold since his birth. The revelation of Paris's royal heritage came through a series of athletic contests held in Troy to commemorate the supposed death of the infant prince years earlier. Priam, tormented by guilt over his decision to expose his son, had instituted annual games in the child's memory. When Paris arrived in the city to participate in these competitions, his extraordinary athletic prowess and noble bearing caught the attention of Cassandra, whose prophetic abilities allowed her to recognize her long-lost brother despite his rustic appearance. The reunion between Paris and his family was marked by joy tempered with unease. Priam, now an aging monarch whose once black beard had turned silver, embraced the son he had condemned to death, while Queen Hecuba wept tears of both happiness and foreboding. The royal court of Troy welcomed their returned prince with elaborate ceremonies, but the older members of the council remembered the prophecies that had led to his abandonment and watched nervously as he took his place among the city's nobility. Paris adapted quickly to palace life, his natural charisma and handsome features making him popular among Troy's aristocratic youth. He stood tall and lean, with the bronze skin of someone who had spent years under the sun and possessed the easy confidence that came from divine favour. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, and his eyes held a restless quality that suggested a man destined for great deeds, whether glorious or catastrophic. The finest craftsmen in Troy worked to outfit him with clothing befitting his status, richly embroidered tunics, golden armbands, and a sword whose bronze blade had been forged by master smiths. Aphrodite, meanwhile, had not forgotten her promise to the prince who had awarded her the golden apple. The goddess began weaving the circumstances that would bring Paris into contact with Helen of Sparta, the woman whose beauty had become legendary throughout the Greek world. Helen's reputation extended far beyond her physical appearance. She was known as the daughter of Zeus himself, born from the union between the king of the gods and Leda, wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta. Helen's divine parentage manifested itself in beauty so extraordinary that men who saw her often found themselves unable to speak coherently for several minutes afterward. Her hair was the colour of spun gold falling in perfect waves that caught the light like precious metal. Her skin possessed the luminous quality of polished marble, unmarked by the blemishes or imperfections that affected ordinary mortals. Most striking of all were her eyes, which shifted between blue and grey like the Aegean Sea under changing skies, holding depths that seemed to reflect divine wisdom and mortal vulnerability in equal measure. The political implications of Helen's extraordinary beauty had become apparent when she reached marriageable age. Suitors arrived in Sparta from every corner of the Greek world, each hoping to win the hand of the most beautiful woman alive. These men were not merely love-struck youths, but powerful kings and princes who understood that marriage to Helen would bring enormous prestige and potentially valuable alliances. The list of suitors read like a catalogue of Bronze Age nobility: Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece; his brother Menelaus, a capable warrior and administrator; Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca whose reputation for cunning was already well established; Ajax the Greater from Salamis, a giant of a man whose strength was legendary; Diomedes of Argos, a fierce warrior still young but already renowned for his prowess in battle, and dozens of other nobles whose combined military might represented a significant portion of Greek military power. King Tyndareus found himself in an impossible position. Choosing any single suitor would inevitably anger all the others, potentially creating enemies of men whose friendship Sparta needed. The rejected suitors might form alliances against Sparta, or even attempt to take Helen by force, plunging the kingdom into a war it could not hope to win against such overwhelming opposition. The king spent sleepless nights pacing the halls of his palace, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. The solution came from an unexpected source. Odysseus, whose reputation for clever problem-solving was already well established, approached Tyndareus with a proposal that would protect Sparta while binding all the suitors to a common cause. The Ithacan king suggested that all of Helen's suitors should swear a sacred oath to defend whichever man she chose as her husband, promising to come to his aid if anyone ever attempted to steal her away or harm their marriage. This oath would transform potential enemies into sworn allies, creating a powerful defensive alliance centered around Helen's marriage. The oath of Tyndareus, as it came to be known, was sworn in the most solemn manner possible. Each suitor placed his hand upon the severed pieces of a sacrificial horse while invoking the gods as witnesses to his vow. They swore by Zeus the Oathkeeper, by the earth that supported them, and by the sun that saw all things, that they would defend Helen's chosen husband against any who might threaten their union. The ritual took place in Sparta's main temple, with priests conducting the ceremonies that would bind these powerful men to their word through divine compulsion. The binding nature of this oath cannot be overstated in the context of Bronze Age society. Breaking a sacred vow sworn before the gods was considered one of the most heinous crimes possible, bringing down divine wrath not only upon the oathbreaker but potentially upon his entire kingdom. The gods were believed to punish perjury with plagues, famines, military defeats, and other catastrophes that could destroy entire civilizations. No king or nobleman could risk such consequences, making the oath an unbreakable bond that would hold even in the face of enormous personal cost. After all the suitors had sworn their binding oath, Helen made her choice. She selected Menelaus, the younger brother of Agamemnon, as her husband. The decision was influenced by several practical considerations beyond personal attraction. Menelaus was a proven warrior and competent administrator who could protect Sparta's interests. His brother's position as High King of Mycenae meant that marriage to Menelaus would align Sparta with the most powerful kingdom in Greece. Additionally, Menelaus possessed a more gentle temperament than some of the other suitors, suggesting he would treat Helen with the respect due to her divine heritage. The wedding of Helen and Menelaus was celebrated with magnificent festivities that lasted for 7 days. Kings and nobles from across the Greek world attended the ceremonies, bringing costly gifts and participating in athletic contests, feasts, and religious observances. The palace of Sparta glittered with gold and silver, while the finest musicians and poets performed works composed specifically for the occasion. Helen appeared at her wedding dressed in robes of pure white linen bordered with gold thread, wearing a crown of precious stones that had been crafted by the most skilled jewellers in Greece. For nearly 10 years, the marriage of Helen and Menelaus appeared to be everything that Tyndareus had hoped. Sparta prospered under Menelaus's rule, maintaining strong alliances with other Greek kingdoms while avoiding the conflicts that periodically erupted between rival city-states. Helen proved to be not only a beautiful queen but also an intelligent and capable one, involving herself in diplomatic negotiations and cultural patronage that enhanced Sparta's reputation throughout the Mediterranean world. The royal couple had one child together, a daughter named Hermione, whose beauty promised to rival even that of her mother. The little girl possessed Helen's golden hair and striking eyes, combined with Menelaus's strength of character and natural leadership abilities. The palace of Sparta echoed with the sound of her laughter as she played in the courtyards and gardens, representing the hope and continuity of the royal line. However, Aphrodite had not forgotten her promise to Paris, and the goddess of love began arranging circumstances that would bring the Trojan prince into contact with Helen. The opportunity arose when diplomatic tensions between Troy and several Greek kingdoms created the need for high-level negotiations. Priam, seeking to resolve these disputes through peaceful means, decided to send an embassy to the Greek mainland. Paris, now recognised as a prince of Troy and eager to prove himself in diplomatic service, volunteered to lead this mission. The embassy's official purpose was to address various commercial and territorial disputes that had arisen between Troy and the Greek kingdoms. Trojan merchants had complained of unfair treatment in Greek ports, while Greek traders claimed that Troy was imposing excessive fees for passage through the Dardanelles. There were also questions about fishing rights in disputed waters and the status of various islands that both sides claimed. These were exactly the kind of complex technical issues that required careful negotiation by experienced diplomats. Paris's embassy consisted of approximately 50 men, including experienced diplomats, translators, guards, and servants necessary for such a high-level mission. The ships that carried them were among the finest in Troy's fleet, painted in bright colours and equipped with purple sails that announced their royal status to any who saw them approaching. The vessels carried not only the embassy members, but also valuable gifts intended to honour the Greek kings they would visit and demonstrate Troy's wealth and goodwill. The embassy's first major stop was Sparta, where Menelaus received them with the courtesy due to royal ambassadors. The Spartan king, now in his 30s with the weathered features of a man who had spent years training for war and administering a kingdom, welcomed the Trojans into his palace and provided them with the finest accommodations available. According to the customs of Bronze Age hospitality, guests were considered sacred, and their safety and comfort were the host's primary responsibility. Paris's first sight of Helen struck him with the force of a physical blow. The Queen of Sparta had matured from the beautiful girl who had chosen Menelaus into a woman whose beauty transcended mortal understanding. She moved with fluid grace through the palace halls, her presence seeming to illuminate whatever room she entered. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that poets would later claim could charm wild beasts and make stones weep. Paris found himself staring openly at her during formal receptions, forgetting his diplomatic duties as he contemplated the woman Aphrodite had promised would be his. Helen, for her part, was not immune to Paris's considerable charms. The Trojan prince represented something exotic and exciting compared to the familiar world of Sparta. His stories of Troy's magnificence, his descriptions of the great city's walls and towers, and his accounts of the sophisticated court life there, painted a picture of a civilization that surpassed anything in Greece. More importantly, Paris possessed the easy confidence and romantic nature that appealed to a woman who had spent 10 years in a marriage based more on political necessity than passionate love. The attraction between Paris and Helen developed gradually over the weeks of the embassy's stay in Sparta. What began as polite conversation during formal dinners evolved into private meetings in the palace gardens, where they could speak freely away from the watchful eyes of courtiers and servants. Paris regaled Helen with tales of his adventures as a shepherd on Mount Ida, his discovery of his royal heritage, and his dreams of making Troy the greatest city in the world. Helen, in turn, spoke of her divine parentage, her memories of choosing Menelaus from among her many suitors, and her sometimes lonely existence as Queen of Sparta. Menelaus, trusting in the sacred bonds of hospitality and unaware of the divine forces working against his marriage, treated Paris with genuine friendship and respect. The Spartan king showed his guest the finest aspects of his kingdom, including the training grounds where Spartan warriors honed their skills, the workshops where master craftsmen created weapons and jewellery, and the temples where the gods were honoured with elaborate ceremonies. This hospitality, extended in good faith to a fellow royal, would make the eventual betrayal all the more bitter and shameful. The political situation that had prompted Paris's embassy was resolved through patient negotiation and mutual compromise. The various trade disputes were settled through agreements that satisfied both sides, fishing rights were clearly delineated, and the status of contested territories was resolved through diplomatic protocols that had been developed over generations of Greek interstate relations. From a purely diplomatic perspective, the mission was an unqualified success that enhanced Troy's reputation as a reasonable and trustworthy partner in international affairs. However, as the time approached for the embassy's departure, Paris faced a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of both Troy and the Greek kingdoms. Aphrodite's promise echoed in his mind, while the growing attraction between himself and Helen made the thought of returning to Troy without her seem unbearable. The goddess of love had kept her word by bringing them together. Now it remained for Paris to claim the reward he'd been promised when he awarded her the golden apple. The decision to take Helen from Sparta was influenced by factors beyond simple romantic desire. Paris genuinely believed that Helen's feelings for him were as strong as his for her, and he convinced himself that he was rescuing her from a loveless marriage rather than committing an act of theft. The political implications of his actions, the sacred nature of the hospitality he was violating, and the inevitable consequences for both kingdoms were overshadowed by his certainty that love justified any sacrifice. On the night chosen for their departure, Paris and Helen made their final preparations in secret. The Queen of Sparta gathered her most precious possessions, including jewellery that had been wedding gifts and gold that would support them during their journey to Troy. She left behind her daughter Hermione, a decision that would haunt her for years to come, but which seemed necessary to ensure the child's safety during what was certain to be a turbulent period. The escape from Sparta was accomplished with careful planning and divine assistance. Aphrodite ensured that the palace guards were unusually drowsy, while favourable winds filled the sails of the Trojan ships as they departed under cover of darkness. Helen's absence was not discovered until the following morning, when her servants found her chambers empty and her most valuable possessions missing. The realization that she had departed willingly rather than being taken by force was evident from the careful selection of items she had taken and the absence of any signs of struggle. Menelaus's discovery of his wife's departure struck him like a physical blow. The king of Sparta had awakened, expecting to bid farewell to his Trojan guests, and instead found himself betrayed by both his wife and the man he'd treated as an honoured friend. The violation of hospitality was particularly galling to a society that considered the protection of guests one of the most sacred duties. Paris had not only stolen Helen, but had done so while enjoying Menelaus's protection and friendship, making the crime doubly heinous. The immediate aftermath of Helen's departure saw Menelaus struggling with emotions that ranged from heartbreak to fury to humiliation. The personal betrayal was compounded by the political implications of losing his wife to a foreign prince. Helen was not merely his spouse, but also the symbol of his legitimacy as king of Sparta, since his claim to the throne derived largely from his marriage to her. Her departure called into question his ability to protect what was his and potentially weakened his position among the other Greek kings. Menelaus's first impulse was to pursue the fleeing couple immediately, but practical considerations prevented such hasty action. A single ship could not hope to catch the Trojan fleet, which had several hours' head start and divine favour ensuring favourable winds. More importantly, any attempt to recover Helen would require careful planning and substantial military support, since Troy was one of the most powerful cities in the known world and would not surrender her without a fight. Instead, Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, whose position as High King of Mycenae made him the most powerful ruler in the Greek world. The palace of Mycenae, with its massive walls built from stones so large that later generations would believe they had been placed by giants, served as the centre of a confederation that included most of the major Greek kingdoms. Agamemnon's authority derived not only from Mycenae's military strength but also from his skill as a political leader who could coordinate the efforts of independent-minded kings. The meeting between the two brothers took place in Agamemnon's great hall, a vast chamber whose walls were decorated with frescoes depicting hunting scenes and military victories. The High King of Mycenae was an imposing figure in his mid-30s, taller and broader than Menelaus, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His beard was carefully trimmed in the fashion of Mycenaean nobility, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of a ruler who had spent years managing complex political relationships. Agamemnon's response to his brother's plight was immediate and decisive. The theft of Helen was not merely a personal insult to Menelaus, but a challenge to the entire system of Greek interstate relations. If Troy could steal the wife of a Greek king with impunity, it would encourage other foreign powers to test Greek resolve and potentially upset the delicate balance of power that maintained stability throughout the region. More practically, Agamemnon recognized that a successful military expedition against Troy would bring enormous prestige and wealth to its leaders. The High King's decision to support his brother's cause was also influenced by long-standing tensions between the Greek kingdoms and Troy. The wealthy city's control of the Dardanelles Strait gave it enormous economic leverage over Greek trade, allowing Troy to impose fees and restrictions that limited Greek commercial expansion. A war that resulted in Troy's conquest would eliminate this obstacle to Greek prosperity and potentially open new markets throughout Asia Minor. The activation of the Oath of Tyndareus provided Agamemnon with the legal and moral justification needed to transform a personal dispute into a pan-Greek crusade. The sacred vows sworn by Helen's former suitors created binding obligations that no king could ignore without risking divine punishment. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the Greek world, carrying bronze tablets that reminded the oath-bound kings of their sacred duties and summoned them to fulfill their vows. The response to these summons varied considerably among the different kingdoms. Some rulers, like Nestor of Pylos, an elderly king whose wisdom was respected throughout Greece, immediately began preparing their forces for war. Nestor, despite his advanced age, recognized that the oath must be honored regardless of personal cost, and he began assembling ships and warriors for what he correctly anticipated would be a long and difficult campaign. Other kings attempted to avoid their obligations through various stratagems. Odysseus of Ithaca, whose marriage to Penelope had come after Helen's wedding, initially feigned madness to avoid participating in the expedition. When Agamemnon's representatives arrived at his island kingdom, they found the king ploughing his fields with oxen and sowing salt instead of grain, acting as though he had lost his mind. However, Palamedes, one of the cleverest men in Greece, exposed this deception by placing Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in front of the plough. The king immediately stopped his oxen to avoid harming the child, proving that his madness was feigned. Achilles presented a different challenge entirely. The greatest warrior of his generation was still little more than a boy, living on the island of Scyros disguised as a girl at his mother Thetis's insistence. The sea nymph, knowing that her son was destined to die young if he participated in the war, had hidden him among the daughters of King Lycomedes in hopes of keeping him safe. However, Odysseus and Diomedes tracked him down through a clever ruse, bringing gifts of jewellery and weapons to the royal court and watching to see which items attracted the most attention from the supposed maidens. The diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis peacefully began almost immediately after Helen's arrival in Troy. Menelaus, despite his anger and humiliation, recognised that war would bring enormous costs to both sides and initially hoped that negotiation might still recover his wife without bloodshed. Priam, meanwhile, faced a difficult decision about whether to return Helen or support his son's actions, knowing that either choice would have serious consequences for Troy's future. The first embassy sent to Troy consisted of Menelaus himself, accompanied by Odysseus and several other respected Greek leaders. Their mission was to demand Helen's return, along with compensation for the insult to Spartan honour and the violation of hospitality. The embassy travelled under the protection of sacred truces that guaranteed their safety during negotiations, allowing them to enter Troy without fear of being harmed or detained. The reception of the Greek embassy in Troy revealed the deep divisions within the Trojan court about how to handle the crisis. King Priam, now an elderly monarch whose long reign had brought prosperity and peace to his kingdom, was torn between his love for his son and his recognition that keeping Helen might bring catastrophe upon Troy. The old king's weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent weighing options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. The Greek embassy's negotiations in Troy had failed spectacularly, with Priam's council ultimately deciding to support Paris's claim to Helen despite the enormous risks involved. The Trojan king's decision was influenced by several factors beyond paternal loyalty. Helen's divine parentage made her a valuable asset that could bring Troy prestige and potentially divine protection, while returning her would be seen as weakness that might encourage future Greek aggression. Most significantly, many Trojan nobles argued that Helen had come to Troy willingly, making her departure from Sparta a matter of personal choice rather than abduction. The breakdown of diplomatic negotiations left Agamemnon with no alternative but to honour the oath of Tyndareus and organise the massive military expedition that would become known as the Trojan War. The High King of Mycenae established his headquarters at Aulis, a natural harbour on the eastern coast of Boeotia that provided an ideal assembly point for the coalition fleet. The location offered protected anchorage for hundreds of ships while being strategically positioned for the crossing to Asia Minor. The process of assembling the Greek coalition required months of intensive political manoeuvring and diplomatic pressure. Agamemnon's authority as High King gave him significant influence over the other rulers, but the Greek political system was fundamentally based on voluntary cooperation between independent kingdoms rather than centralized imperial control. Each king retained sovereignty over his own territory and could theoretically withdraw from the coalition at any time, making unity a constant challenge that required careful management of competing interests and egos. The military contingents that began arriving at Aulis represented the full spectrum of Greek Bronze Age society. The largest and most impressive force came from Mycenae itself, where Agamemnon had assembled over 100 ships carrying approximately 3,000 warriors. These men were equipped with the finest bronze weapons and armour that Mycenaean craftsmen could produce, including figure-eight shields made from multiple layers of oxhide reinforced with bronze studs, boar's tusk helmets that provided excellent protection while displaying the wearer's hunting prowess, and long bronze-tipped spears that could penetrate enemy armour at considerable distances. Menelaus arrived from Sparta with 60 ships carrying his kingdom's elite warriors, men who had been trained from childhood in the demanding military traditions that would later make Sparta legendary throughout the ancient world. The Spartan contingent was smaller than some others, but was widely regarded as among the most disciplined and effective fighting forces in the coalition. Their bronze armour gleamed with careful maintenance, and their weapons showed the signs of constant practice that mark professional soldiers rather than occasional warriors. Nestor of Pylos brought 90 ships filled with veterans of numerous campaigns, men whose experience in warfare complemented their king's reputation for tactical wisdom. Despite being well into his 70s, Nestor remained vigorous and alert, his white beard and lined face commanding respect from warriors young enough to be his grandsons. The Pylian force included many men who had fought alongside Nestor in earlier conflicts, creating a cohesive unit that could execute complex maneuvers with minimal communication. The arrival of Odysseus with his 12 ships from Ithaca marked a significant moment in the coalition's development. The Ithacan king had finally accepted the inevitability of war after his failed attempt to avoid the expedition through feigned madness. Odysseus brought not only competent warriors, but also his reputation for cunning and strategic thinking that would prove invaluable during the long siege ahead. His ships were smaller than those of the major kingdoms, but were crewed by experienced sailors who knew every current and wind pattern in the Ionian Sea. Ajax the Greater arrived from Salamis with 12 ships carrying warriors whose size and strength were legendary throughout Greece. Ajax himself stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to support the massive tower shield that was his signature weapon. His men were similarly imposing, selected not only for their fighting ability, but for their physical presence that could intimidate enemies before battle even began. The Salaminian contingent specialised in close combat, where their size advantage could be most effectively employed. Diomedes of Argos brought 80 ships filled with some of the most aggressive and skilled warriors in the coalition. Despite his youth, Diomedes had already established himself as a formidable military leader through successful campaigns against neighbouring kingdoms. His men were equipped with the latest innovations in bronze weaponry, including improved sword designs and reinforced spear points that could penetrate even the finest armour. The Argive force was known for its mobility and aggressive tactics that could break enemy formations through sheer audacity. The process of integrating these diverse forces into a coherent military organisation presented enormous challenges. Each contingent brought its own traditions, equipment, and tactical preferences that had to be coordinated into an effective fighting force. Language differences, while not insurmountable since all the kingdoms spoke related Greek dialects, still created communication difficulties that could prove dangerous in combat situations. More significantly, the various kings and nobles had to establish a clear command structure that respected traditional hierarchies while ensuring effective military leadership. Agamemnon's position as supreme commander was accepted by most of the coalition leaders, but this acceptance was based on practical necessity rather than enthusiastic support. The High King of Mycenae possessed the largest military force and the most extensive resources, making him the logical choice to coordinate the expedition. However, his authority was limited by the independent nature of the various contingents and the strong personalities of the other kings, who expected to be consulted on major decisions rather than simply following orders. The most significant challenge to coalition unity came from the delayed arrival of Achilles, whose participation was considered essential for the expedition's success. The young warrior's reputation had already spread throughout the Greek world despite his youth, with stories of his incredible speed, strength, and fighting skill making him legendary even before he had participated in any major conflicts. Thetis's attempts to keep her son hidden on Syros had ultimately failed when Odysseus and Diomedes tracked him down through their clever ruse with the gifts. Achilles arrived at Aulis accompanied by his closest companion Patroclus, and leading 50 ships from his father Peleus's kingdom of Phthia. The Myrmidons, as his warriors were called, represented a different tradition of warfare than the other Greek contingents. These men were trained in rapid assault tactics that emphasized speed and individual prowess, rather than the more methodical approaches favoured by larger armies. Their equipment was lighter than that of other warriors, allowing for greater mobility but requiring superior skill to use effectively. The young hero's first appearance at Aulis created a sensation among the assembled warriors. Achilles stood just under 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of a trained athlete, rather than the bulkier frame typical of Bronze Age warriors. His golden hair fell to his shoulders in carefully maintained waves, and his eyes held an intensity that seemed to burn with inner fire. Most striking of all was his movement, which displayed a fluid grace that made even simple actions appear effortless and beautiful. Achilles' motivations for joining the expedition were fundamentally different from those of the other leaders. While kings like Agamemnon and Menelaus were driven by political considerations and personal honour, the young hero sought something more abstract but equally powerful, eternal fame that would ensure his name lived forever in human memory. His mother Thetis had revealed to him the prophecy that governed his fate. He could choose a long, peaceful life that would be quickly forgotten, or a short, glorious existence that would make him immortal in song and story. The decision to pursue glory over longevity was characteristic of the heroic mentality that dominated Bronze Age warrior culture. For men like Achilles, the prospect of being remembered and celebrated for generations was worth any sacrifice, including life itself. This attitude was reinforced by the religious beliefs of the time, which held that exceptional warriors could achieve a form of immortality through their deeds, joining the ranks of legendary heroes whose stories inspired future generations. The assembly at Aulis also revealed the complex web of personal relationships and rivalries that would influence the expedition's conduct. Agamemnon's leadership style, which combined genuine military competence with an imperious manner that often offended his subordinates, created tensions that would periodically threaten coalition unity. The High King's tendency to claim the largest share of any spoils and his insistence on formal recognition of his authority rankled other leaders who considered themselves his equals in all but military strength. Odysseus emerged as a crucial mediator between Agamemnon and the other kings, using his reputation for wisdom and diplomatic skill to resolve disputes before they could escalate into serious conflicts. The Ithacan king understood that the expedition's success depended on maintaining unity among leaders whose personal ambitions and traditional rivalries could easily destroy the coalition. His efforts to smooth over disagreements and find compromises acceptable to all parties would prove essential throughout the long campaign ahead. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a large force at Aulis were enormous and required careful planning to avoid disaster. Over 1,000 ships carrying approximately 50,000 warriors, along with the necessary support personnel, created demands for food, water and supplies that strained the resources of the entire region. Local farmers and merchants found themselves suddenly wealthy as the coalition purchased massive quantities of grain, meat, wine and other necessities at premium prices. The harbour at Aulis became a bustling centre of activity as ships arrived daily from across the Greek world. The beach was lined with vessels of every size and description, from Agamemnon's massive flagship with its purple sails and golden decorations, to smaller craft that carried contingents from minor kingdoms. The constant activity of loading and unloading supplies, maintaining equipment and conducting military exercises created a cacophony of sounds that could be heard for miles across the Boeotian countryside. The religious aspects of the expedition required extensive ceremonies and sacrifices to ensure divine favour for the crossing to Asia Minor. Priests from various kingdoms conducted elaborate rituals designed to honour the gods and seek their protection for the warriors who would soon face battle. These ceremonies were not merely symbolic, but were considered essential for military success, since Bronze Age warfare was understood to be as much a contest between divine powers as between mortal armies. The most significant religious challenge facing the expedition arose from an unexpected source: the goddess Artemis, who controlled the winds necessary for the fleet's departure. As the ships assembled at Aulis and preparations for departure neared completion, the winds that should have carried them across the Aegean simply stopped blowing. Day after day passed with the sea remaining unnaturally calm, trapping the massive fleet in harbour while supplies dwindled and morale began to deteriorate. The priests and seers accompanying the expedition struggled to determine the cause of this divine intervention. Various explanations were proposed, including insufficient sacrifices, improper ritual procedures, and the anger of gods who opposed the war for their own reasons. However, the true cause was eventually revealed by Calchas, the most respected prophet in the Greek forces, whose ability to interpret divine will was renowned throughout the coalition. Calchas announced that Artemis was demanding the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter, as the price for favourable winds. The goddess's anger had been provoked by the High King's boast that he was a better hunter than Artemis herself, a claim made during a successful hunt shortly before the expedition's departure. The virgin goddess, who protected young animals and presided over the hunt, considered this boast an intolerable insult that could only be expiated through the sacrifice of what Agamemnon valued most. The demand for Iphigenia's sacrifice created the most serious crisis the coalition had yet faced. Agamemnon's initial reaction was absolute refusal, declaring that no military objective could justify the murder of his own child. The High King's paternal feelings were reinforced by his wife, Clytemnestra's desperate pleas to spare their daughter, and by the recognition that such a sacrifice would violate the most fundamental bonds of family loyalty that held Bronze Age society together. However, the continued absence of wind made the expedition's situation increasingly desperate. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the various contingents were beginning to show signs of restlessness that could easily escalate into open mutiny. Some kings began suggesting that the expedition should be abandoned, arguing that divine opposition made success impossible. Others proposed alternative sacrifices that might appease Artemis without requiring Iphigenia's death, but Calchas insisted that the goddess would accept no substitutes. The pressure on Agamemnon intensified as Odysseus and other leaders pointed out the political consequences of the expedition's failure. The massive resources invested in assembling the coalition would be completely wasted, while the Greek kingdom's reputation for military effectiveness would suffer permanent damage. More immediately, the various kings who had sacrificed their own interests to honour the oath of Tyndareus would return home empty-handed, potentially creating lasting resentment against Mycenaean leadership. The final decision was reached through a combination of political calculation and religious conviction that characterized Bronze Age royal decision-making. Agamemnon ultimately concluded that his duty as supreme commander of the expedition outweighed his obligations as a father, particularly since the sacrifice was demanded by divine will rather than human ambition. The High King's acceptance of this terrible necessity was facilitated by Odysseus' suggestion that Iphigenia could be summoned to Aulis under the pretense of marriage to Achilles, sparing her the knowledge of her true fate until the final moment. The deception required to bring Iphigenia to Aulis involved sending messages to Clytemnestra, claiming that Achilles had requested the princess's hand in marriage, and that the wedding should take place immediately before the fleet's departure. This supposed honour was presented as recognition of Agamemnon's leadership and a way to strengthen ties between the royal houses of Mycenae and Phthia. Clytemnestra, despite some suspicions about the hasty arrangements, ultimately agreed to bring Iphigenia to Aulis for what she believed would be her daughter's wedding. The arrival of Iphigenia at the military camp created a stark contrast between innocence and the brutal realities of warfare. The princess, barely 16 years old, possessed the fresh beauty of youth combined with the dignity appropriate to her royal status. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate braids decorated with golden ornaments, and her white linen dress was embroidered with patterns that proclaimed her virginity and noble birth. She moved through the camp with the excitement of a young woman anticipating her wedding, unaware that she was walking toward her death. The deception was maintained until the final moments, when Iphigenia was led to what she believed was the altar for her wedding ceremony. The realization of her true fate came only when she saw the sacrificial knife in the priest's hand and understood the meaning of her father's tears. The princess's reaction combined the terror natural to any young person facing death, with the courage expected of royal blood, as she ultimately accepted her fate as necessary for the expedition's success and the honour of Greece. The sacrifice of Iphigenia had secured the winds necessary for the Greek fleet's departure, but it also revealed the true cost of divine favour and the terrible prices that heroes were willing to pay for glory. As the 1,000 ships finally set sail across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, they carried not only the largest military force ever assembled in the Bronze Age world, but also the hopes, ambitions and destinies of men whose names would echo through history for millennia to come. Among these warriors, none commanded more attention or inspired greater awe than Achilles, son of the sea nymph Thetis and King Peleus of Thea. The young hero's divine parentage manifested itself in abilities that transcended normal human limitations, making him the most formidable warrior of his generation and arguably of any generation. His mother's immortal blood had granted him speed that allowed him to move across a battlefield like lightning, striking down enemies before they could react to his presence. His reflexes operated at superhuman levels, enabling him to dodge spears thrown at close range and parry sword strikes that would have killed ordinary men. The most famous aspect of Achilles' divine heritage was his near invulnerability, achieved through Thetis's desperate attempt to grant her son immortality. When he was still an infant, the sea nymph had dipped him in the waters of the river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The sacred waters had rendered his body impervious to bronze weapons, arrows, and the normal injuries that plagued mortal warriors. However, the heel by which Thetis had held him during the ritual remained vulnerable, creating the single point of weakness that would ultimately prove fatal. This invulnerability had shaped Achilles' entire approach to warfare, allowing him to fight with a reckless abandon that would have been suicidal for any other warrior. He could charge directly into enemy formations without concern for defensive positioning, trusting his divine protection to preserve him while he carved through opposing ranks with his bronze sword. His fighting style emphasized overwhelming offensive power rather than careful tactics, as he possessed the unique ability to ignore most enemy attacks while focusing entirely on destroying his opponents. Yet Achilles' greatest burden was not his invulnerability, but the prophecy that governed his entire existence. Thetis had revealed to her son that he faced a choice that no other hero had ever confronted. He could live a long, peaceful life as a minor king ruling over Thea in comfortable obscurity until he died of old age, forgotten by history within a generation. Alternatively, he could achieve immortal fame through glorious deeds in battle, but this path would lead inevitably to an early death, cutting short his life in its prime. The decision between longevity and glory represented the fundamental tension at the heart of Bronze Age heroic culture. For warriors raised on stories of legendary heroes whose deeds inspired songs and poems, the prospect of being forgotten was worse than death itself. Achilles had chosen fame over life, accepting that his participation in the Trojan War would seal his doom while ensuring that his name lived forever in human memory. This knowledge gave his every action a poignant intensity, as he understood that each battle might be his last. The physical appearance of Achilles reflected his divine heritage in ways that set him apart from even the most impressive mortal warriors. He stood just under 6 feet tall, with the lean, perfectly proportioned build of a trained athlete, rather than the bulkier frame typical of Bronze Age fighters. His golden hair caught sunlight like spun metal, falling in waves to his broad shoulders and framing a face that combined masculine strength with an almost feminine beauty. His eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to reflect the intensity of his emotions, shifting from warm amber when he was pleased to cold fury when his anger was aroused. Achilles' armour had been crafted by Hephaestus himself, the divine smith whose workshop lay beneath Mount Etna. The bronze gleamed with an inner light that seemed to come from within the metal itself, while the intricate decorations depicted scenes of cosmic significance that told the story of mortal life from birth to death. His shield bore images of cities at peace and war, farmers working their fields, and dancers celebrating festivals, creating a miniature representation of the entire human experience. His spear, cut from an ash tree on Mount Pelion and tipped with bronze forged in divine fires, was so heavy that no other warrior could even lift it, much less wield it effectively in combat. The Myrmidons who followed Achilles into battle were themselves exceptional warriors, selected not only for their fighting ability but for their absolute loyalty to their leader. These men had been trained from childhood in the specific tactics that complemented Achilles' superhuman abilities, learning to follow his lightning-fast charges and exploit the gaps he created in enemy formations. Their equipment was lighter than that used by other Greek contingents, emphasizing mobility and speed over heavy protection, since their role was to support Achilles' individual prowess, rather than engage in the methodical warfare favoured by larger armies. Standing in stark contrast to Achilles' divine touch perfection was Hector, eldest son of King Priam and the greatest defender Troy had ever produced. Where Achilles fought for personal glory and immortal fame, Hector's motivations were rooted in duty, honour and love for his family and city. The Trojan prince embodied the ideal of the responsible warrior king, a man whose strength was matched by his wisdom and whose courage was tempered by genuine concern for those he protected. Hector's physical presence commanded respect through sheer competence rather than divine enhancement. He stood over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and powerful frame of a man who had spent decades training with weapons and armour. His dark hair was kept shorter than was fashionable among Trojan nobility, a practical choice that prevented enemies from grabbing it during close combat. His face bore the weathered features of a professional soldier with scars that testified to years of defending Troy's walls against raiders and rival kingdoms. His dark eyes held a steady intelligence that could assess battlefield situations with remarkable accuracy, identifying threats and opportunities that less experienced warriors might miss. As Crown Prince of Troy, Hector carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal combat prowess. He served as the primary military commander for Troy's forces, coordinating the defence of the city's massive walls and organising the various allied contingents that had come to support Priam's kingdom. His tactical knowledge encompassed not only individual fighting techniques, but also the complex logistics of siege warfare, the management of supplies during extended conflicts, and the diplomatic skills necessary to maintain unity among Troy's diverse allies. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on Hector's shoulders, as he understood better than most the true cost of the war that was approaching. Unlike younger warriors who saw the conflict as an opportunity for glory and adventure, Hector recognized that the Greek expedition represented an existential threat to Troy's survival. The sheer size of the coalition fleet, combined with the reputation of warriors like Achilles and Ajax, meant that Troy faced the greatest military challenge in its history. The prince spent sleepless nights walking the walls of his city, studying the defensive preparations and trying to anticipate the strategies that the Greeks might employ. Hector's personal life provided him with additional motivation to defend Troy successfully. His wife Andromache, daughter of King Eetion of Cilician Thebes, represented everything that made life worth preserving. She possessed the quiet beauty and gentle nature that provided a peaceful refuge from the harsh realities of warfare, while her intelligence and strong character made her a valued advisor on matters both personal and political. Their infant son, Scamandrius, whom the people of Troy called Astyanax, or Lord of the City in recognition of his father's status, embodied the future that Hector fought to protect. The contrast between Hector's family responsibilities and Achilles' solitary pursuit of glory highlighted fundamental differences in their characters and motivations. Where Achilles could focus entirely on his own fame and fighting prowess, Hector bore the weight of protecting thousands of people who depended on his success. The Trojan prince understood that his death would not only end his own story, but would leave his family and city vulnerable to destruction. making his approach to warfare more cautious and calculated than that of his Greek counterpart. Among the other Greek heroes who had gathered for the expedition, Ajax the Greater of Salamis stood out for his sheer physical presence and defensive capabilities. The son of Telamon stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders so broad that he could carry the massive tower shield that was his signature weapon without being slowed by its weight. This shield, constructed from 7 layers of ox hide reinforced with bronze plates, was large enough to provide complete protection for Ajax and any companions fighting beside him. His strength was legendary throughout the Greek world, with stories telling of his ability to hurl boulders that required 4 ordinary men to lift. Ajax's fighting style emphasized defensive excellence rather than the flashy offensive techniques favored by heroes like Achilles. He served as an anchor point around which other warriors could rally, providing a stable defensive position that could withstand enemy charges while his companions maneuvered for advantage. His bronze-tipped spear was proportioned to match his enormous size, allowing him to strike enemies at distances that kept them well beyond the reach of their own weapons. In close combat, his swordwork was methodical and devastating, each blow delivered with enough force to shatter enemy shields and armour. The psychological impact of Ajax's presence on the battlefield was as significant as his physical capabilities. Enemy warriors who saw his towering figure approaching often lost their nerve before combat even began, recognizing that they faced an opponent whose size and strength made victory virtually impossible. This intimidation factor allowed Ajax to control large sections of the battlefield simply through his presence, forcing enemies to avoid areas where he might intervene while freeing other Greek warriors to pursue more aggressive tactics. Diomedes of Argos represented a different type of heroic excellence, combining youthful energy with tactical brilliance that made him one of the most dangerous warriors in the Greek coalition. Despite being among the youngest of the major heroes, Diomedes had already established himself as a formidable military leader through successful campaigns against neighbouring kingdoms. His reputation was built on aggressive tactics that caught enemies off guard and decisive leadership that could turn the tide of battle through sheer audacity. The young king of Argos possessed the lean, athletic build of a warrior who relied on speed and skill rather than brute strength. His movements displayed the fluid grace of a trained dancer, allowing him to flow between offensive and defensive positions with remarkable ease. His bronze armour was crafted in the latest style, incorporating improvements in design that provided better protection while reducing weight. His weapons showed the attention to detail that marked a professional soldier, with edges kept razor-sharp and bronze points polished to mirror brightness. Diomedes' courage bordered on recklessness, as he possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure while making split-second decisions that often meant the difference between victory and defeat. His tactical innovations had already influenced Greek military thinking, particularly his use of coordinated cavalry charges that could break enemy formations before they could organize effective resistance. The warriors who followed him into battle were inspired by his fearless leadership and his willingness to share the risks he asked them to take. Perhaps the most complex and intellectually gifted of the Greek heroes was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose reputation for cunning and strategic thinking was already legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. Unlike heroes who relied primarily on physical prowess, Odysseus had built his reputation on mental agility that could find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. His ability to devise clever stratagems and see through enemy deceptions made him invaluable to the Greek coalition, particularly in situations where brute force alone would not suffice. Odysseus possessed a compact, muscular build that reflected his background as both warrior and sailor. Years of navigating the treacherous waters around his island kingdom had given him the balance and coordination necessary for fighting on ship decks or uneven terrain. His weathered face showed the effects of sun and salt spray, while his grey eyes held an intelligence that could assess complex situations and identify hidden opportunities that others might miss. His beard was kept neatly trimmed in the fashion of Greek nobility, though it often showed traces of silver that reflected his maturity and experience. The Ithacan king's approach to warfare emphasized preparation and psychological manipulation rather than direct confrontation. He studied enemy weaknesses with the same intensity that other heroes devoted to weapon practice, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited through careful planning rather than overwhelming force. His speeches could inspire courage in demoralized troops or sow doubt among enemy ranks, making him as dangerous with words as other heroes were with bronze weapons. Among Achilles' companions, none held a more important place than Patroclus, whose loyalty and devotion to the greatest Greek warrior had become legendary throughout the coalition. The exact nature of their relationship remained a subject of speculation among their contemporaries, but there was no question that their bond transcended ordinary friendship, or even the close ties that typically bound warriors who fought side by side. Patroclus served as Achilles' closest advisor, the one person whose counsel the volatile hero would accept without question. Patroclus possessed considerable fighting ability in his own right, though he was inevitably overshadowed by his companion's divine-enhanced capabilities. He stood slightly shorter than Achilles, with the solid build of a warrior who had trained extensively, but lacked the supernatural advantages of divine parentage. His dark hair and brown eyes provided a visual contrast to Achilles' golden appearance, while his calmer temperament served as a moderating influence on the younger hero's more impulsive tendencies. The role that Patroclus played in Achilles' life extended beyond military companionship to encompass emotional support and practical guidance. He understood better than anyone the burden that Achilles carried in knowing his fate, and he provided the human connection that kept the semi-divine hero grounded in mortal concerns. His presence served as a reminder of the bonds of friendship and loyalty that made life worth living, even for someone destined for early death and eternal fame. On the Trojan side, Paris remained a controversial figure whose actions had triggered the entire conflict. Despite his role in causing the war, the prince possessed genuine fighting ability, particularly as an archer whose accuracy with bow and arrow was renowned throughout Asia Minor. His skill with ranged weapons allowed him to contribute to Troy's defence, while avoiding the close combat that might expose him to heroes whose martial prowess far exceeded his own. Paris's arrows, crafted by the finest fletchers in Troy and tipped with bronze points that had been blessed by Apollo, could strike targets at distances that made retaliation difficult for enemies armed with spears and swords. The prince's relationship with Helen remained a source of strength and vulnerability for Troy's cause. Their love, whatever its origins in divine manipulation, had deepened during their time together in the city, creating a personal bond that went beyond the political ramifications of their union. Helen's presence in Troy served as a constant reminder of what the war was ultimately about, while her divine heritage provided the city with a symbolic connection to the gods that could inspire defenders and potentially influence divine favour. Aeneas, son of the goddess Aphrodite and the mortal Anchises, represented another crucial element in Troy's defence. His divine parentage, while not as extensive as Achilles's, still granted him enhanced abilities that made him one of Troy's most effective warriors. More importantly, his reputation for piety and devotion to the gods had earned him respect throughout the city and among Troy's allies. Aeneas's leadership of the Dardanian contingent provided Troy with experienced warriors who could match the Greeks in both equipment and training. The Trojan hero's fighting style emphasized defensive tactics and careful positioning rather than the aggressive charges favored by heroes like Achilles or Diomedes. His bronze armor was crafted in the Trojan fashion, with overlapping plates that provided excellent protection, while allowing for the mobility necessary in siege warfare. His shield bore the image of his divine mother, serving both as spiritual protection and as a reminder of his special status among the defenders. Among Troy's most formidable allies was Sarpedon, king of Lycia and son of Zeus himself. His divine parentage made him one of the few warriors who could potentially match Achilles in single combat, while his experience as a ruler provided Troy with another source of tactical expertise. The Lycian contingent that followed Sarpedon represented some of the finest warriors in Asia Minor, men who had been trained in fighting techniques that differed from both Greek and Trojan traditions, but were equally effective in battle. Sarpedon's presence among Troy's defenders carried special significance because of his relationship to Zeus, the king of the gods. His participation in the war created potential complications for divine intervention, since Zeus would face the painful choice between supporting his son and maintaining the neutrality that the other gods expected from him. This divine connection made Sarpedon both a valuable asset and a potential source of cosmic conflict that could influence the war's ultimate outcome. The gathering of so many legendary warriors on both sides of the conflict had created a situation unprecedented in Bronze Age warfare. Never before had so many heroes of such exceptional ability been assembled for a single campaign, and the potential for individual combat between champions of this caliber promised battles that would be remembered for generations. The stage was set for confrontations that would test the limits of human courage and divine favour, as the greatest warriors of their age prepared to face each other in combat that would determine not only their personal fates, but the destiny of entire civilizations. The massive Greek fleet approached the Trojan coastline in the early morning hours, their bronze-reinforced prows cutting through waters that reflected the golden light of dawn. Over 1,000 ships stretched across the horizon in a formation that had taken weeks to perfect, with Agamemnon's flagship leading the centre, while the various contingents maintained their assigned positions. The sight of so many vessels moving in coordinated formation created a spectacle that had never been witnessed before in the Bronze Age world, as the combined naval power of virtually every Greek kingdom converged on the beaches below Troy's towering walls. The initial landing proved far more challenging than the Greek commanders had anticipated. Trojan scouts had observed the approaching fleet from their watchtowers and had quickly relayed warnings to the city's defenders. By the time the first Greek ships reached the shallow waters near the beach, Hector had already deployed a substantial force of Trojan and allied warriors along the shoreline, positioning them behind hastily constructed earthworks and wooden barriers that would provide cover from Greek arrows, while allowing defenders to strike at landing parties as they struggled through the surf. The beach itself presented natural obstacles that favoured the defenders. Rocky outcroppings divided the coastline into smaller sections, preventing the Greeks from landing their entire force simultaneously, while channeling their approach into predictable areas where Trojan archers could concentrate their fire. The sand sloped steeply in places, making it difficult for heavily armoured warriors to maintain their footing as they waded ashore carrying weapons and shields. Scattered boulders provided additional cover for defending forces, while creating hazards for attackers who were unfamiliar with the local terrain. Agamemnon's battle plan called for coordinated landings at 3 separate points along the coast, with different contingents assigned to each location based on their specific capabilities and equipment. The centre assault would be led by Menelaus and his Spartan warriors, whose discipline and training made them ideal for the difficult task of establishing a secure beachhead under enemy fire. Ajax the Greater would lead the right flank attack, using his massive shield and defensive expertise to protect other warriors as they gained footing on the shore. The left flank would be commanded by Diomedes, whose aggressive tactics and mobile forces could potentially outflank Trojan positions if they could establish a foothold on the rocky terrain. The first casualties of the war occurred before any Greek warrior set foot on Trojan soil. As the leading ships entered arrow range, Trojan archers positioned on elevated ground began releasing volleys that struck down rowers and marines who lacked adequate protection. The bronze-tipped arrows, fired from composite bows that could drive projectiles through leather armour at considerable distances, found gaps in Greek defences and inflicted wounds that would prove fatal to men far from home and proper medical care. The cries of wounded warriors mixed with the splash of oars and the shouted commands of ship captains trying to maintain formation under increasingly difficult circumstances. Protesilaus of Philippi achieved the dubious honour of being the first Greek warrior to die on Trojan soil, struck down by a spear thrown from the walls even as he leaped from his ship onto the beach. The young king's death fulfilled an oracle that had predicted the first Greek to land would not survive the war, but his sacrifice inspired his followers to fight with desperate courage as they sought to avenge their fallen leader. The Philician contingent carved out a small section of beach through sheer determination, though their position remained precarious as Trojan reinforcements moved to contain the landing. The establishment of the main Greek beachhead required hours of brutal fighting as warriors struggled to gain secure footing while under constant attack from defenders who knew every rock and gully along the coastline. Menelaus led his Spartans in a methodical advance that slowly pushed back the Trojan skirmishers, using overlapping shields to create mobile fortifications that could advance steadily despite enemy arrows and spears. The Spartan king's bronze armour showed multiple dents from impacts that would have killed lesser warriors, while his spear dripped with the blood of Trojan defenders who had tried to halt his advance. Ajax the Greater's assault on the right flank demonstrated the psychological impact that exceptional warriors could have on ancient battlefields. The giant warriors approached through the surf, carrying his massive tower shield and bronze-tipped spear, caused several Trojan defenders to abandon their positions rather than face him in direct combat. Those who remained found their weapons ineffective against his superior reach and strength, as Ajax methodically cleared sections of beach through individual combat prowess that bordered on the supernatural. His presence allowed other Greek warriors to land safely behind his protective shield, gradually expanding the secure area under Greek control. The most dramatic action occurred on the left flank, where Diomedes attempted to outflank the main Trojan defensive line by landing his forces on rocky terrain that most commanders would have considered impassable. The young king of Argos led his warriors in a climbing assault that bypassed prepared defensive positions, though the approach required abandoning heavy equipment and accepting significant casualties from falls and injuries sustained on the jagged rocks. The successful completion of this difficult manoeuvre allowed Greek forces to attack Trojan positions from an unexpected direction, forcing Hector to withdraw his defenders to more defensible positions further inland. The first day's fighting established patterns that would characterize the entire siege. Trojan tactics emphasized defensive positioning and the use of terrain advantages to offset Greek numerical superiority, while Greek strategy relied on coordinated assaults that could overwhelm isolated defensive positions through concentrated force. Both sides demonstrated the military competence that had made their respective civilizations dominant powers in the Bronze Age world, but neither could achieve the decisive victory that might have ended the conflict quickly. The establishment of the Greek camp required extensive engineering work that revealed the logistical sophistication necessary for maintaining such a large force in hostile territory. The chosen site occupied elevated ground approximately 2 miles from Troy's walls, close enough to maintain pressure on the city, while far enough to avoid surprise attacks from the massive gates that could disgorge thousands of defenders. The natural harbour provided protection for the beach ships while allowing for the arrival of supply vessels from Greece, though maintaining these supply lines would prove to be one of the expedition's greatest challenges. The fortification of the camp began immediately after the beachhead was secured, as Greek engineers supervised the construction of earthworks and wooden palisades that would protect the army during its extended stay. These defensive works followed established Greek military engineering principles, with overlapping fields of fire that could channel enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones. Watchtowers provided early warning of Trojan movements, while carefully positioned gates allowed for rapid deployment of forces when opportunities for offensive action arose. The internal organisation of the camp reflected the complex political relationships within the Greek coalition. Each major contingent was assigned its own section, with boundaries that respected traditional hierarchies while ensuring effective communication and coordination. Agamemnon's headquarters occupied the central position, from which he could maintain contact with all subordinate commanders while remaining protected by the most reliable forces. The arrangement of tents and supply areas followed patterns that had been developed through generations of Greek military experience, creating an efficient system for managing the daily needs of 50,000 warriors and support personnel. The first major battle after the landing occurred when Hector led a massive sortie, designed to drive the Greeks back into the sea before they could complete their fortifications. The Trojan prince had assembled nearly 15,000 warriors, including contingents from allied cities throughout Asia Minor, in an attempt to overwhelm Greek positions through sheer numbers. The attack began before dawn, with Trojan forces moving silently through the darkness to achieve a surprise against Greek sentries who were still adjusting to the challenges of maintaining watch in unfamiliar territory. The assault initially achieved considerable success, as Trojan warriors penetrated the incomplete Greek fortifications at several points and engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat within the camp itself. Hector led the main attack personally, his bronze armour gleaming in the light of burning tents as he carved through Greek defenders with methodical efficiency. The Trojan prince's spearwork displayed the technical mastery that had made him legendary throughout Asia Minor, each thrust precisely aimed to exploit gaps in enemy armour, while his shield deflected counterattacks with minimal effort. The crisis was resolved through the intervention of Achilles, who had been sleeping in his tent when the Trojan attack began, but was awakened by the sounds of combat and the glow of fires spreading through the camp. The young hero's response demonstrated the superhuman speed that set him apart from other warriors, as he armed himself and reached the main fighting in minutes, despite starting from the far side of the camp. His arrival on the battlefield created an immediate shift in momentum, as Trojan warriors who had been pressing their advantage suddenly found themselves facing an opponent whose reputation preceded him. The combat between Achilles and Hector during this first major engagement established the pattern for their future encounters. Both warriors recognized in each other the most dangerous opponent they were likely to face, leading to a careful, probing style of fighting that emphasized technique and positioning rather than reckless aggression. Hector's experience and tactical knowledge were matched against Achilles' divine-enhanced abilities, creating a contest that neither could dominate decisively. Their spears clashed repeatedly as each sought openings in the other's defense, while the warriors around them gradually ceased their own fighting to witness this encounter between champions. The duel ended inconclusively when other Trojan and Greek leaders intervened to prevent the loss of either hero so early in the conflict. Both sides recognized that the death of their primary champion would create psychological and tactical disadvantages that might prove decisive in the long campaign ahead. The withdrawal of the main combatants allowed the broader battle to resume, though with less intensity as both armies had been sobered by the realization of what they faced in the coming months. The establishment of regular combat patterns began within days of the initial landing, as both sides adapted to the realities of siege warfare. Greek forces would typically deploy in the early morning, forming battle lines that challenged Trojan defenders to emerge from behind their walls for open combat. These formations displayed the tactical sophistication that had made Greek armies dominant throughout the Aegean, with carefully coordinated movements that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. Trojan responses varied depending on the specific circumstances and the forces available for deployment. When conditions favoured defensive action, Hector would keep his warriors behind the massive walls while archers and sling-armed skirmishers harassed Greek formations from protected positions. However, when opportunities arose for effective counterattacks, the Trojan prince would lead sorties designed to inflict casualties on exposed Greek units before withdrawing to safety behind the fortifications. The role of individual champions became increasingly important, as both sides sought to maintain morale and demonstrate their continued fighting effectiveness. Single combat between notable warriors provided opportunities for personal glory while allowing armies to gauge their relative strength without committing to major battles that might prove decisive. These encounters followed established protocols that had been developed over generations of Bronze Age warfare, with formal challenges issued and accepted according to traditions that both sides respected. The daily routines that developed during the siege reflected the practical necessities of maintaining large military forces over extended periods. Greek warriors would typically rise before dawn to perform equipment maintenance and consume the morning meal, which consisted primarily of bread, cheese, and wine diluted with water. Training exercises occupied much of the morning, as commanders recognized the importance of maintaining fighting effectiveness during the long periods between major engagements. The afternoon hours were usually devoted to foraging expeditions, diplomatic missions, or small-scale raids designed to gather intelligence about Trojan capabilities and intentions. These activities provided necessary supplies while keeping warriors active and preventing the boredom and restlessness that could lead to disciplinary problems within the camp. Evening meals featured whatever provisions could be obtained locally, supplemented by supplies shipped from Greece when weather and enemy action permitted. The presence of women within both camps added complexity to the daily routines and social dynamics of the siege. Briseis, daughter of King Briseus of Lyrnessus, had been captured during one of the early Greek raids and awarded to Achilles as his prize. Her beauty and noble bearing made her a valued possession, but her intelligence and strong character also made her a confidant, whose advice the volatile hero increasingly valued. The relationship that developed between them transcended the typical master-slave dynamic, though it remained constrained by the social conventions that governed Bronze Age society. Chryseis, daughter of Chryses who served as a priest of Apollo, found herself in a similar situation after being captured and awarded to Agamemnon. Her father's religious position created additional complications, as his prayers to Apollo for his daughter's return would eventually bring divine intervention that threatened the entire Greek expedition. The High King's refusal to accept ransom for her release demonstrated the pride and stubbornness that characterized his leadership style, though it also set the stage for conflicts that would nearly destroy the coalition. The impact of prolonged warfare on both armies became apparent within the first months of the siege. Greek forces, accustomed to relatively brief campaigns that ended in decisive victories, struggled to adapt to the grinding routine of siege warfare that offered few opportunities for the glorious individual combat that motivated Bronze Age warriors. The constant threat of Trojan attacks, combined with the challenges of maintaining supply lines across the Aegean, created stress that manifested itself in disciplinary problems and conflicts between different contingents. Trojan defenders faced different but equally serious challenges as they adjusted to life under siege. The city's massive walls provided excellent protection, but they also created a sense of confinement that affected civilian morale and military effectiveness. The constant vigilance required to guard against Greek attacks exhausted defenders, while the gradual depletion of supplies created economic pressures that threatened Troy's ability to maintain its resistance over the long term. The siege of Troy had settled into a grinding routine of daily skirmishes and raids, but the true complexity of the conflict lay not in the clash of bronze weapons or the manoeuvring of armies across the Trojan plain. Above the mortal battlefield, the gods themselves had chosen sides with the same passion and prejudice that drove their human counterparts, transforming what might have been a straightforward military campaign into a cosmic struggle that would test the very foundations of divine authority. The partisan involvement of the Olympian gods had begun even before the first Greek ship touched Trojan shores. Aphrodite, whose promise to Paris had initiated the entire conflict, remained steadfastly committed to protecting Troy and ensuring that her chosen champion would not suffer for his decision to award her the golden apple. The goddess of love understood that Paris's fate was inextricably linked to her own reputation among the immortals, making his success or failure a reflection of her power and influence within the divine hierarchy. Apollo, the god of prophecy, music and plague, had aligned himself with the Trojan cause for reasons that extended beyond simple preference. The golden god had served King Laomedon, Priam's father, during his period of punishment for rebelling against Zeus, and despite the conflict over unpaid wages that had ended that service, Apollo maintained a protective interest in the city, whose walls he had helped construct. More immediately, the god's extensive network of oracles and prophetic shrines throughout Asia Minor created natural sympathies with the peoples of that region, making Troy's cause his own through cultural and religious connections. Ares, the god of war himself, had thrown his support behind Troy with the enthusiasm of a deity who thrived on conflict and bloodshed. The bronze-armoured god saw in the siege an opportunity for the kind of prolonged, brutal warfare that fed his divine essence, while the heroic nature of Troy's defence against overwhelming odds appealed to his appreciation for martial courage. Ares' involvement brought not only divine favour, but also the intangible benefits of enhanced warrior fury and battlefield inspiration that could turn the tide of individual combats. On the opposing side, Hera's hatred for Troy stemmed directly from the judgment of Paris, and her humiliation at being rejected in favour of Aphrodite. The Queen of the Gods possessed a memory for slights that extended across centuries, and her wounded pride demanded nothing less than the complete destruction of the city whose prince had insulted her. Her support for the Greek cause was absolute and uncompromising, driven by personal vendetta rather than any consideration of justice or mercy. Athena's opposition to Troy was equally personal, and perhaps even more dangerous due to her reputation for strategic thinking and tactical innovation. The grey-eyed goddess of wisdom had been offended not merely by Paris's judgment, but by the implication that intellectual excellence was less valuable than physical beauty. Her involvement in the Greek cause brought divine guidance to their military planning and individual inspiration to warriors who faced seemingly impossible odds in their assault on Troy's massive fortifications. Poseidon, the earthshaker who ruled the seas, harboured grievances against Troy that predated the current conflict by decades. Like Apollo, he'd served King Laomedon and had been cheated of his promised payment, creating a divine grudge that time had not diminished. The god's control over earthquakes and oceanic forces made him a particularly valuable ally for the Greeks, whose supply lines depended entirely on safe passage across the Aegean Sea. The first major divine intervention occurred during the early weeks of the siege, when Aphrodite demonstrated the extent to which the gods would involve themselves in mortal combat. Paris had accepted a challenge to single combat from Menelaus, a duel that would theoretically settle the entire conflict through the ancient tradition of representative warfare. The two men met in the space between the opposing armies, watched by thousands of warriors who understood that the outcome might determine their own fates. The combat began favourably for Menelaus, whose years of military experience and burning desire for revenge gave him significant advantages over the younger, less experienced Trojan prince. The Spartan king's bronze spear found its mark repeatedly, piercing Paris's shield and forcing him to give ground steadily as the duel progressed. Menelaus fought with the methodical precision of a professional warrior, each attack calculated to exploit weaknesses in his opponent's defence while conserving his own energy for the decisive moment. Paris, despite his reputation as a skilled archer, found himself outmatched in close combat by an opponent whose superior training and overwhelming motivation made him nearly unstoppable. The Trojan prince's bronze armour bore multiple dents from impacts that would have killed a lesser warrior, while his defensive positions grew increasingly desperate as Menelaus pressed his advantage. The watching armies could sense the approaching conclusion of a duel that would restore Helen to her rightful husband and potentially end the war before it had truly begun. The intervention came at the moment when Menelaus had gained a decisive advantage, his bronze sword raised for the killing blow that would avenge his dishonour and reclaim his stolen wife. Aphrodite, watching from Olympus, could not permit her chosen champion to suffer such a humiliating defeat, particularly when his death would invalidate the promise she had made to secure the golden apple. The goddess descended to the battlefield in a cloud of mist that concealed her actions from mortal eyes, snatching Paris away from certain death and transporting him instantly to his chambers within Troy's walls. The disappearance of Paris at the crucial moment created confusion and anger among both armies. Menelaus, deprived of his victory and his revenge, raged across the empty battlefield, searching for an opponent who'd simply vanished. The Greek king's frustration was shared by his followers, who had witnessed what appeared to be divine interference that robbed them of a legitimate triumph. The Trojans, meanwhile, found themselves in the awkward position of having their champion rescued by obvious supernatural intervention, creating doubts about the honour and legitimacy of their cause. Athena's guidance of Diomedes during the siege's early battles demonstrated another form of divine intervention that would characterise the conflict. The young king of Argos had already established himself as one of the most aggressive and effective Greek warriors, but the goddess's influence elevated his abilities to superhuman levels during a single day of combat that would be remembered as one of the war's most extraordinary individual achievements. The transformation began when Athena approached Diomedes before dawn, appearing to him in the form of an elderly priest whose wise counsel masked the divine intelligence behind his words. The goddess removed the mortal mist from the warrior's eyes, granting him the ability to distinguish between human opponents and the gods who might be fighting alongside them. This divine sight would prove crucial as the day's battles unfolded, allowing Diomedes to engage immortal opponents while avoiding the fatal mistake of attacking gods who were beyond mortal reach. Armed with divine vision and inspired by Athena's presence, Diomedes launched himself into combat with a fury that astonished even experienced warriors who had fought alongside him for years. His bronze spear seemed to find its target with supernatural accuracy, striking down Trojan champions who had previously been considered nearly invincible. His movements displayed a fluid grace that allowed him to flow between offensive and defensive positions without apparent effort, while his tactical decisions showed an intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics that exceeded his natural abilities. The climax of Diomedes' divinely inspired day came when he encountered Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, in single combat near Troy's walls. The Trojan hero, protected by his divine mother's favour, had seemed invulnerable to mortal weapons until Diomedes' enhanced abilities allowed him to inflict a serious wound despite Aeneas' supernatural protection. The injury would have proven fatal had Aphrodite not intervened personally, descending to the battlefield to rescue her son from the consequences of his defeat. Diomedes' response to Aphrodite's intervention shocked both armies and established a precedent that would influence divine involvement throughout the siege. Rather than respectfully withdrawing when faced with an immortal opponent, the Greek hero actually attacked the goddess herself, his bronze spear finding her divine flesh and drawing the golden ichor that flowed in immortal veins. Aphrodite's scream of pain and surprise echoed across the battlefield as she fled to Olympus, nursing a wound that would heal but would not be forgotten. The wounding of Aphrodite by a mortal warrior created ripples throughout the divine hierarchy that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The goddess's humiliation at the hands of a human, even one inspired by Athena, challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mortals and immortals. Other gods who had been considering direct intervention in the conflict were forced to reconsider their involvement, recognizing that divine participation carried risks that had not previously been apparent. Apollo's protection of Hector throughout the siege represented a more subtle but equally significant form of divine intervention. The god of prophecy had recognized in Troy's greatest defender a mortal worthy of immortal support, a warrior whose courage and dedication to duty embodied the heroic ideals that Apollo valued. This divine favour manifested itself not through dramatic rescues or supernatural enhancements, but through the kind of battlefield luck and tactical inspiration that could mean the difference between victory and defeat in individual combats. The protection became most evident during Hector's encounters with Greek champions, who possessed superior individual abilities or divine favour of their own. When facing Ajax the Greater, whose enormous size and strength should have provided decisive advantages, Hector found himself able to match the giant warrior's power through perfectly timed movements and precisely placed spear thrusts. The Trojan prince's bronze armour seemed to deflect blows that should have penetrated, while his own attacks found gaps in Ajax's defences that appeared almost by accident. During his confrontations with Diomedes, Apollo's influence allowed Hector to survive encounters with a warrior whose divine inspiration made him nearly unstoppable against ordinary opponents. The god's intervention took the form of subtle adjustments to timing and positioning that prevented Diomedes from achieving the decisive advantages that had characterized his victories over other Trojan champions. Hector's spearwork during these battles displayed technical mastery that exceeded his natural abilities, while his defensive movements showed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy attacks. The most dramatic example of Apollo's protection occurred during a general battle when Patroclus, wearing Achilles' distinctive armour, led the Myrmidons in an assault on Troy's walls. The god recognized that Patroclus' death would be necessary to draw Achilles back into active combat, but he also understood that Hector needed divine assistance to overcome an opponent protected by the greatest armour in the Greek army. Apollo's intervention took the form of striking the armour from Patroclus' body at the crucial moment, leaving him vulnerable to Hector's bronze spear and ensuring the Trojan victory that would reshape the war's trajectory. The plague that Apollo sent against the Greek army demonstrated the most devastating form of divine intervention, showing how mortal actions could provoke supernatural wrath with consequences that affected entire armies. The crisis began with Agamemnon's treatment of Chryses, an elderly priest of Apollo who had come to the Greek camp seeking to ransom his daughter Chryseis from captivity. The High King's arrogant rejection of the priest's legitimate request, accompanied by threats and insults that violated the sacred status accorded to religious officials, created the conditions for divine retribution on a massive scale. Chryseis' prayer to Apollo for vengeance followed established protocols for invoking divine justice against those who had wronged the god's servants. The priest's words, spoken at Apollo's altar with the proper rituals and offerings, carried the weight of legitimate grievance that demanded supernatural response. The god's anger was kindled not merely by the insult to his priest, but by Agamemnon's demonstration of the kind of hubris that threatened the proper relationship between mortals and immortals. The plague struck the Greek camp with devastating suddenness, beginning with the pack animals and gradually spreading to affect the warriors themselves. The divine arrows that Apollo fired from his silver bow were invisible to mortal eyes but carried death that no bronze armour could deflect. The symptoms began with fever and weakness that progressed rapidly to agonizing death, creating panic among warriors who had faced enemy spears without fear but found themselves helpless against supernatural disease. The tactical implications of the plague extended far beyond the immediate casualties, as the Greek army found its operational effectiveness severely compromised by the need to care for the sick and dispose of the dead. Normal military routines became impossible as entire units were incapacitated, while the constant funeral pyres required enormous quantities of wood that had to be gathered from increasingly distant sources. The psychological impact was equally severe, as warriors who had maintained confidence in their eventual victory began to question whether the gods favoured their cause. Calchas, the most respected prophet in the Greek forces, eventually identified the plague's divine origin and the specific actions that had provoked Apollo's wrath. The seer's revelation that Chryseis must be returned to her father without ransom created a direct challenge to Agamemnon's authority and personal pride, setting the stage for the conflict with Achilles that would dominate the siege's middle phase. The High King's initial refusal to accept the prophet's diagnosis prolonged the plague's devastation, while demonstrating the dangerous consequences of defying divine will. Zeus's position throughout these divine interventions remained carefully neutral, though his attempts to balance competing interests among the Olympians created its own form of cosmic tension. The king of the gods had made a binding promise to Thetis that he would honour Achilles by allowing Trojan victories until the Greeks recognised the young hero's essential value to their cause. This commitment required Zeus to restrain his own sympathies for the Greek cause while preventing other gods from intervening too decisively on either side. The promise to Thetis had been extracted through the sea nymph's reminder of services she had rendered to Zeus during his conflict with other Olympians who had attempted to overthrow his rule. Her support during that crisis had been crucial to maintaining divine order, creating an obligation that Zeus could not ignore despite the complications it created for his management of the Trojan conflict. The king of the gods found himself bound by his own word to support outcomes that conflicted with his broader interests in maintaining stability among both mortals and immortals. The tension this created among the Olympians manifested itself in increasingly bold attempts by partisan gods to influence the war's course through direct intervention. Hera's frustration with Zeus's neutrality led to elaborate schemes designed to circumvent his restrictions, while technically remaining within the bounds of divine law. Her seduction of Zeus, accomplished through borrowed beauty from Aphrodite and the assistance of sleep, allowed pro-Greek gods to intervene decisively during the king's temporary distraction from earthly affairs. The consequences of these divine machinations affected not only the immediate tactical situation, but also the broader cosmic order that Zeus was responsible for maintaining. Each intervention created precedents that other gods could cite to justify their own involvement, while the escalating nature of divine participation threatened to transform the mortal conflict into a war between the Olympians themselves. The king of the gods found himself walking an increasingly narrow line between honouring his commitments and preventing the complete breakdown of divine restraint. The mortal warriors caught between these competing divine influences faced challenges that extended far beyond the normal dangers of Bronze Age warfare. Individual heroes found their fates determined as much by divine favour as by personal skill, while entire armies could see their fortunes reversed through supernatural intervention that no amount of tactical brilliance could anticipate or counter. The siege of Troy had become a testing ground for the relationship between gods and mortals, with consequences that would reshape both human and divine understanding of their proper roles in the cosmic order. The divine interventions that had characterized the siege's opening phase created an atmosphere of supernatural tension that pervaded both camps, but it was a fundamentally human conflict over honor and authority that would precipitate the war's most significant crisis. The plague sent by Apollo had finally been lifted through the reluctant return of Chryseis to her father, but Agamemnon's compliance with divine demands had come at a cost that would reshape the entire dynamic of the Greek coalition. The High King's wounded pride demanded compensation for his lost prize, and his gaze fell upon Briseis, the captive Trojan princess who had become Achilles' most valued possession. The confrontation between Agamemnon and Achilles began during a council meeting held in the High King's tent, where the assembled Greek leaders had gathered to address the continuing challenges of maintaining the siege. The pavilion, constructed from the finest materials available to the expedition, displayed the wealth and power that Agamemnon commanded as a leader of the coalition. Bronze tripods and golden cups lined the walls, while richly woven carpets covered the ground where kings and princes sat in deliberation. The air was thick with the smoke of burning incense and the tension that had been building between the two most powerful figures in the Greek army. Agamemnon's demand for Briseis was presented as a matter of royal prerogative, justified by his position as supreme commander and his recent sacrifice in returning Chryseis to appease Apollo's wrath. The High King argued that his leadership of the expedition entitled him to compensation when circumstances forced him to relinquish legitimate prizes of war. His bronze-reinforced voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. while his weathered features showed the strain of commanding a coalition that seemed constantly on the verge of dissolution. The demand struck at the core of Achilles' identity and value system in ways that transcended simple material loss. Briseis represented far more than a captive woman or a symbol of military success. She had become the tangible proof of his excellence as a warrior and his rightful place among the greatest heroes of his generation. The young hero had captured her during the sack of Lyrnessus, one of Troy's allied cities, in a battle that had demonstrated his supernatural combat abilities and strategic brilliance. Her presence in his tent served as a daily reminder of his achievements and his unique status among the Greek forces. More significantly, Briseis had evolved from a prize of war into something approaching a genuine companion whose intelligence and noble bearing had earned Achilles' respect and affection. Their relationship, while constrained by the social conventions that governed captive women, had developed emotional depths that made her loss particularly painful. She served not only as a source of comfort, but as one of the few people who could moderate his volatile temperament and provide counsel that he would accept without question. Achilles' response to Agamemnon's demand revealed the fundamental tensions that had been building within the Greek leadership structure since the expedition's beginning. The young hero's divine heritage and unmatched combat abilities had made him increasingly impatient with the political maneuvering and diplomatic compromises that characterized coalition warfare. His mother Thetis's influence and his prophetic knowledge of his own fate had created a sense of destiny that made submission to mortal authority seem both unnecessary and degrading. The argument that erupted between the two leaders quickly escalated beyond the immediate issue of Briseis' ownership to encompass broader questions of authority, merit, and the proper relationship between kings and heroes. Agamemnon insisted that his position as High King of Mycenae and supreme commander of the expedition gave him ultimate authority over all prizes taken by Greek forces, regardless of who had actually captured them. His claim was supported by traditional precedents and the practical necessities of maintaining unity within a coalition that included dozens of independent rulers with competing interests. Achilles rejected this assertion with a fury that reflected both his divine parentage and his growing frustration with what he perceived as Agamemnon's incompetent leadership. The young hero pointed to his own contributions to the siege, noting that his personal combat prowess and the elite Myrmidon forces under his command had been responsible for many of the expedition's most significant victories. He argued that his achievements entitled him to respect and autonomy rather than treatment as a subordinate whose possessions could be redistributed at the High King's whim. The confrontation reached its climax when Achilles drew his bronze sword, the divine weapon forged by Hephaestus that no mortal blade could match. The assembled Greek leaders watched in stunned silence as the greatest warrior of his generation prepared to strike down the supreme commander, an action that would have shattered the coalition and ended any hope of taking Troy. The moment stretched endlessly as Achilles weighed his options, his golden hair catching the lamplight and his eyes burning with the divine fire that marked his supernatural heritage. The intervention of Athena prevented what would have been a catastrophic murder within the Greek leadership. The goddess appeared to Achilles alone, invisible to the other council members, and restrained his sword arm through a combination of divine compulsion and reasoned argument. Her words promised that greater honours would come to him if he controlled his immediate rage, while her presence reminded him of the cosmic forces that were invested in the war's outcome. The divine intervention saved Agamemnon's life but did nothing to resolve the underlying conflict between the two leaders. Instead of physical violence, Achilles chose a form of retaliation that would prove far more damaging to Greek prospects than any single death could have been. He formally withdrew himself and his Myrmidon forces from active participation in the siege, declaring that he would no longer risk his life for leaders who showed him no respect or gratitude. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled council, as the other kings realized that they were losing their most effective warrior at a time when Trojan resistance was growing stronger and more organised. The withdrawal was not merely a temporary sulking, but a complete disengagement that removed approximately 3,000 of the Greek army's most elite warriors from active service. The Myrmidons had been trained specifically to complement Achilles' supernatural abilities, and their absence created tactical gaps that could not be filled by reassigning other contingents. Their expertise in rapid assault tactics and their reputation for absolute loyalty to their leader made them irreplaceable assets whose loss significantly weakened Greek offensive capabilities. Achilles' decision to remain in the camp while refusing to participate in military operations created a visible symbol of division that affected morale throughout the Greek forces. His black ships, drawn up on the beach in their assigned section, became a constant reminder of the coalition's internal conflicts and the price of wounded pride. Warriors from other contingents would often gather near the Myrmidon camp, hoping to catch glimpses of the legendary hero, whose absence from battle had become the siege's most significant development. The psychological impact of Achilles' withdrawal extended beyond simple military considerations to affect the fundamental confidence that had sustained Greek efforts throughout the siege's early phases. The young hero's presence had provided a sense of inevitable victory that allowed other warriors to endure the hardships and frustrations of siege warfare. His absence raised questions about divine favour and the ultimate success of the expedition that no amount of tactical planning could address. Agamemnon's initial response to the crisis demonstrated the political skills that had made him supreme commander, while also revealing the limitations of his leadership style. The High King attempted to minimize the significance of Achilles' withdrawal by emphasizing the strength of the remaining forces and the continued support of other major heroes like Ajax and Diomedes. His public statements portrayed the young hero's absence as a temporary setback that would not affect the siege's ultimate outcome, though private conversations with his closest advisors revealed deeper concerns about the coalition's ability to maintain its offensive pressure. The seizure of Briseis was carried out with the formal ceremony that Bronze Age societies required for the transfer of valuable possessions between nobles. Heralds, accompanied by a small guard unit, arrived at Achilles' tent to claim the captive princess, following protocols that emphasized the legal authority behind their actions while attempting to minimize the personal humiliation involved. The young hero's compliance with the formal demand demonstrated his respect for traditional procedures, even as his burning eyes promised future retribution for the insult he had received. Briseis herself became an unwilling symbol of the conflict between the two leaders, her transfer from Achilles' tent to Agamemnon's quarters, watched by hundreds of warriors who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Her dignity during this humiliating process impressed even her captors, as she maintained the bearing appropriate to her royal birth, despite the circumstances that had reduced her to the status of a prize to be traded between Greek commanders. Her departure left Achilles' tent noticeably emptier and reinforced his sense of isolation from the coalition he had once served with distinction. The immediate military consequences of Achilles' withdrawal became apparent during the next major engagement between Greek and Trojan forces. Hector, recognizing that his most dangerous opponent was no longer actively participating in battles, launched a series of aggressive sorties designed to test Greek resolve and potentially achieve decisive victories while their forces remained divided. The Trojan prince's tactical brilliance was enhanced by his understanding that the psychological impact of Achilles' absence might be as important as the actual reduction in Greek combat effectiveness. The first major battle following Achilles' withdrawal demonstrated the extent to which Greek tactical planning had relied on his supernatural abilities. Without the option of deploying the Myrmidons in their traditional role as elite assault troops, Greek commanders found themselves forced to adopt more conservative strategies that emphasized defensive positioning rather than aggressive attacks. The change in approach was immediately apparent to Trojan observers, who noted the reduced intensity of Greek assaults and the more cautious positioning of their battle lines. Ajax the Greater attempted to compensate for Achilles' absence by taking on additional responsibilities as the primary Greek champion, but his defensive fighting style was poorly suited to the kind of inspirational leadership that the young hero had provided. The giant warrior's massive shield and methodical spearwork remained as effective as ever in individual combat, but his presence lacked the galvanizing effect that Achilles' supernatural speed and divine heritage had brought to Greek formations. Warriors who had followed Achilles into seemingly impossible assaults found themselves hesitant to commit to attacks that Ajax's more measured approach seemed to discourage. Diomedes, despite his own exceptional abilities and divine favour, could not single-handedly replace the tactical flexibility that Achilles and the Myrmidons had provided. The young king of Argos possessed the aggressive instincts necessary for breakthrough attacks, but his forces lacked the specialised training and equipment that made the Myrmidons so effective in rapid assault operations. His attempts to fill the gap left by Achilles' withdrawal resulted in several costly failures that further undermined Greek confidence and provided Trojan forces with encouraging victories. The embassy to Achilles represented the Greek leadership's recognition that the siege could not succeed without their greatest warriors' active participation. The selection of ambassadors reflected careful consideration of personal relationships and diplomatic skills that might influence the young hero's decision. Odysseus was chosen for his reputation as a persuasive speaker whose clever arguments had resolved numerous conflicts throughout his career. Ajax the Greater's inclusion recognized the respect that Achilles held for his fellow champion and the bonds of warrior brotherhood that transcended political disputes. Phoenix, Achilles' former tutor and surrogate father, brought the emotional authority that might succeed where formal diplomacy had failed. The embassy's approach to Achilles' tent was conducted with the ceremony appropriate to a diplomatic mission of crucial importance. The three ambassadors wore their finest clothing and carried the symbols of their authority, while a small retinue of servants and guards provided the dignity that Bronze Age protocol required for such negotiations. The evening setting, with torches illuminating the beach and the sound of waves providing a backdrop to their discussions, created an atmosphere that emphasized both the gravity of their mission and the isolation that Achilles had chosen for himself. Odysseus's speech to Achilles represented one of the most sophisticated examples of Bronze Age diplomatic rhetoric, combining appeals to honour, duty and practical self-interest in an attempt to overcome the young hero's wounded pride. The Ithacan king began by acknowledging the legitimacy of Achilles' grievances against Agamemnon, while emphasizing the broader consequences that his continued absence would have for the entire Greek expedition. His arguments skillfully wove together personal and political considerations, suggesting that true heroic greatness required the ability to rise above individual slights for the sake of larger purposes. The catalogue of gifts that Agamemnon offered through his ambassadors demonstrated the High King's recognition of Achilles' true value to the expedition and his willingness to pay an enormous price for reconciliation. The proposed compensation included bronze tripods, golden talents, thoroughbred horses, and captive women whose beauty and noble birth made them suitable companions for the greatest Greek hero. Most significantly, the offer included the return of Briseis herself, along with a solemn oath that she'd not been touched during her time in Agamemnon's possession. The promised rewards for Achilles' return to active service extended beyond immediate material compensation to include honours and privileges that would have made him one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers in the Greek world. Agamemnon offered one of his own daughters in marriage, along with a substantial dowry and the right to choose from among 7 well-fortified cities that would become Achilles' personal domain. The marriage alliance would have elevated the young hero's status from that of a regional prince to a major power within the Messenian political system. Ajax's contribution to the embassy emphasized the bonds of warrior brotherhood and shared sacrifice that had united the Greek heroes throughout their campaigns. The giant warrior's simple, direct speech contrasted sharply with Odysseus's sophisticated rhetoric, but his words carried the emotional weight of genuine friendship and mutual respect. He reminded Achilles of the oaths they had all sworn to support Menelaus's cause and the dishonour that would result from abandoning their comrades in the hour of greatest need. Phoenix's appeal drew upon the deep personal relationship he had developed with Achilles during the young hero's formative years, when the elderly warrior had served as both tutor and surrogate father. His speech recalled the values and ideals that had shaped Achilles' character, emphasizing the importance of mercy, forgiveness, and the wisdom that came from controlling one's anger rather than being controlled by it. The old warrior's tears and obvious emotional distress provided a powerful counterpoint to the formal diplomatic arguments presented by his companions. Achilles' rejection of the embassy's offer revealed the depth of his alienation from the Greek cause and the extent to which his sense of personal honour had been damaged by Agamemnon's treatment. His response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics involved, while maintaining his fundamental position that respect and recognition were more valuable than any material compensation. The young hero's analysis of his situation showed remarkable insight into the broader implications of the conflict and his own role within it. The prophetic knowledge that influenced Achilles' decision added layers of complexity to his rejection of the embassy's terms. His mother Thetis had revealed to him the two possible paths his life could take: a long, peaceful existence that would be quickly forgotten, or a short, glorious career that would ensure immortal fame. The choice between these alternatives had been complicated by his growing understanding that the siege of Troy might not provide the kind of heroic opportunities that would justify the sacrifice of his life. Achilles' detailed response to the ambassadors included a devastating critique of Agamemnon's leadership and the broader conduct of the war that revealed his disillusionment with the entire enterprise. He pointed out that his own efforts had been responsible for capturing 11 cities by sea and 12 by land, providing the Greeks with enormous wealth and strategic advantages that had been squandered through poor leadership and political incompetence. His achievements had received no recognition commensurate with their significance, while lesser warriors had been rewarded more generously for far smaller contributions. The young hero's analysis of his relationship with the Greek cause included a bitter observation about the fundamental injustice of a system that placed political authority above military excellence. He noted that Agamemnon remained safely behind the lines, while warriors like himself faced death in every battle. Yet the High King claimed the right to redistribute prizes taken through others' courage and skill. This critique struck at the heart of Bronze Age political structures and revealed tensions that extended far beyond the immediate conflict between the two leaders. The embassy's failure to achieve reconciliation left the Greek leadership facing a crisis that threatened the entire expedition's viability. The rejection of such generous terms demonstrated that Achilles' withdrawal was not merely a temporary expression of anger, but a fundamental break with the coalition that could not be easily repaired. The ambassadors returned to Agamemnon's tent with the sobering news that their most effective warrior remained committed to his course of non-participation regardless of the consequences for Greek prospects. The immediate aftermath of the failed embassy saw a noticeable decline in Greek morale as word of Achilles' continued refusal spread throughout the camp. Warriors who had maintained hope that the dispute would be quickly resolved now faced the prospect of continuing the siege without their greatest champion, a realization that called into question their ability to achieve ultimate victory. The psychological impact was particularly severe among the younger fighters, who had looked to Achilles as an inspiration and model for their own heroic aspirations. Hector's response to intelligence about the failed embassy demonstrated his tactical acumen and his understanding of the psychological factors that influence battlefield effectiveness. The Trojan prince immediately began planning more aggressive operations designed to exploit Greek demoralization and the tactical gaps created by Achilles' continued absence. His confidence in Trojan prospects had grown steadily since the young hero's withdrawal, and the embassy's failure convinced him that the time had come for decisive action that might break Greek resolve entirely. The consequences of Achilles' intransigence began to manifest themselves in increasingly desperate Greek tactical decisions as commanders struggled to maintain offensive pressure without their most effective forces. The absence of the Myrmidons forced other contingents to take on roles for which they were poorly suited, while the lack of Achilles' inspirational presence made it difficult to motivate warriors for the kind of aggressive assaults that siege warfare required. The cumulative effect was a gradual shift toward defensive operations that played to Trojan strengths while minimizing Greek advantages. The stage was now set for the series of Trojan victories that would bring the Greek expedition to the brink of complete disaster, as Hector prepared to demonstrate that Troy's defenders could not only resist Greek attacks but could potentially drive the invaders back to their ships and end the siege through decisive military action. The failure of the embassy to Achilles had left the Greek forces in an increasingly precarious position, with their greatest warrior remaining steadfast in his refusal to participate, while Trojan confidence grew with each passing day. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly, as Hector launched a series of coordinated attacks that exploited the gaps left by the Myrmidon withdrawal, pushing Greek forces back toward their ships and threatening to transform the siege into a complete rout. The beaches that had once served as secure staging areas for Greek operations now became contested ground, where desperate defenders fought to prevent Trojan forces from reaching the vulnerable vessels that represented their only means of escape. During this crisis, as Greek casualties mounted and morale plummeted to dangerous levels, Patroclus found himself increasingly tormented by the suffering of his comrades and the knowledge that his closest friend possessed the power to end their ordeal. The young warrior had watched from Achilles' tent as wounded Greeks limped back from failed assaults, their bronze armour dented and their faces bearing the hollow expressions of men who had begun to doubt their cause. The sight of Ajax the Greater, bloodied and exhausted from single-handedly holding sections of the defensive line, particularly affected Patroclus, who understood that even the mightiest heroes had limits that Trojan pressure was rapidly approaching. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus had evolved over years of shared experiences that had forged bonds deeper than ordinary friendship or even the close ties that typically united warriors who fought side by side. Patroclus had served not only as Achilles' companion in battle but as his emotional anchor, the one person whose counsel could moderate the volatile hero's more extreme impulses. His slightly older age and calmer temperament had made him a stabilizing influence during Achilles' youth, while his genuine affection for the golden-haired hero transcended considerations of glory or personal advancement that motivated many relationships within the warrior culture. The physical contrast between the two friends had always been striking, with Patroclus's solid, practical build and dark features providing a visual counterpoint to Achilles' divine-touched beauty and supernatural grace. Where Achilles moved with the fluid perfection of someone whose abilities transcended mortal limitations, Patroclus displayed the competent efficiency of a thoroughly trained professional warrior, whose skills had been honed through years of disciplined practice. His bronze armour, while well crafted and maintained, lacked the divine enhancement that made Achilles' equipment legendary throughout the Greek world. Patroclus' martial abilities were considerable in their own right, though they were inevitably overshadowed by his companion's supernatural prowess. He had proven himself in numerous battles throughout the siege's early phases, demonstrating the tactical intelligence and steady courage that made him a valuable leader of the Myrmidon forces when Achilles was unavailable. His spearwork showed the technical mastery that came from years of training under the same instructors who had shaped Achilles' fighting style, while his understanding of battlefield dynamics allowed him to coordinate complex maneuvers that maximized the effectiveness of the elite troops under his command. The emotional burden that Patroclus carried as he watched the Greek situation deteriorate was compounded by his intimate knowledge of Achilles' internal struggles. He alone fully understood the depth of his friend's hurt at Agamemnon's treatment and the complex mixture of pride, anger and genuine principle that sustained his withdrawal from active combat. Yet Patroclus also recognized that Achilles' absence was causing unnecessary suffering among warriors who had shown him nothing but respect and loyalty throughout the campaign. The decision to approach Achilles with a desperate plea for intervention came after Patroclus had spent a sleepless night listening to the sounds of combat from the latest Trojan assault on the Greek defensive positions. The crash of bronze weapons, the screams of wounded men, and the shouted commands of officers trying to maintain order in increasingly chaotic circumstances created a symphony of suffering that made continued inaction seem like moral cowardice. When dawn revealed the extent of Greek casualties from the night's fighting, Patroclus knew that he could no longer remain silent while his comrades died for want of the help that only Achilles could provide. The conversation between the two friends took place in Achilles' tent, where the hero had been maintaining his isolation from the broader Greek community while nursing his wounded pride and planning his eventual departure from the siege. The interior of the tent reflected Achilles' divine heritage and royal status, with rich tapestries depicting scenes from his family's legendary history and bronze furnishings that gleamed with careful maintenance. Musical instruments lay scattered about, evidence of the cultural pursuits that occupied Achilles during his withdrawal from military activities. Patroclus' initial approach was carefully calibrated to acknowledge his friend's legitimate grievances, while gradually building toward a request that he knew would test their relationship to its limits. He began by describing the current tactical situation in detail, emphasizing the heroic efforts of warriors like Ajax and Diomedes, who were pushing themselves beyond normal human endurance in their attempts to compensate for Achilles' absence. His account of the previous night's fighting included specific examples of courage and sacrifice that demonstrated the quality of men who were dying while their greatest potential saviour remained inactive. The emotional weight of Patroclus' appeal grew as he described individual cases of suffering that had particularly affected him during his visits to the wounded. He spoke of young warriors who had joined the expedition seeking glory, but now lay dying from infected wounds, their dreams of heroic achievement replaced by painful reality. His description of veteran fighters who had served faithfully throughout the siege, but now faced overwhelming odds without adequate support, was designed to appeal to Achilles' sense of honour and responsibility toward those who had earned his protection through their loyalty. The tactical analysis that Patroclus provided revealed his own considerable military intelligence and his deep understanding of the strategic situation facing the Greek forces. He explained how Hector's recent successes had been built upon careful exploitation of the gaps left by the Myrmidon withdrawal, with Trojan forces concentrating their attacks on sectors where Greek defences were weakest. His assessment of current Greek capabilities painted a sobering picture of an army that was approaching the limits of its endurance while facing increasingly confident and well-coordinated enemy forces. Patroclus' description of the morning's council meeting, where Greek leaders had struggled to develop effective responses to their deteriorating position, highlighted the extent to which Achilles' absence had affected not only tactical capabilities, but also strategic planning. The lack of the Myrmidon forces had forced commanders to adopt increasingly conservative approaches that played to Trojan advantages while minimizing the aggressive tactics that had previously characterized Greek operations. The psychological impact of fighting without their greatest champion was evident in the cautious decision-making that had replaced the confident offensive planning of the siege's early phases. The climax of Patroclus' appeal came when he proposed a solution that would allow Achilles to maintain his principled stance against Agamemnon while still providing the assistance that the Greek forces desperately needed. His suggestion that he himself could lead the Myrmidons into battle while wearing Achilles' distinctive armour represented a compromise that might achieve tactical objectives without requiring the hero to abandon his position. The psychological impact of seeing what appeared to be Achilles returning to combat could restore Greek morale while the actual fighting abilities of the Myrmidon forces could provide the tactical advantage necessary to repel Trojan advances. The proposal to use Achilles' armour was not merely a practical suggestion, but a request that touched upon the most fundamental aspects of heroic identity and Bronze Age culture. A warrior's armour, particularly equipment as distinctive and legendary as that worn by Achilles, represented far more than simple protection or status symbols. The divine craftsmanship of Hephaestus had created pieces that were intimately associated with their owner's identity and achievements, making their loan to another warrior a gesture of enormous trust and symbolic significance. Achilles' initial response to Patroclus' request revealed the complex emotions that his withdrawal from combat had generated within him. The young hero's anger at Agamemnon remained undiminished, but his genuine affection for his comrades and his natural instinct to protect those he cared about created internal conflicts that his proud exterior could not entirely conceal. His detailed questions about specific casualties and tactical situations demonstrated that he had been following the siege's progress more closely than his public stance of indifference might have suggested. The decision-making process that led to Achilles' agreement to allow Patroclus to wear his armour involved careful consideration of both practical and symbolic factors. The hero understood that his friend's appearance in the distinctive equipment would indeed provide psychological benefits to Greek forces, while potentially confusing Trojan commanders who might mistake Patroclus for Achilles himself. However, he also recognized the risks involved in allowing someone else to fight while bearing the identity that his armour represented, particularly given the supernatural protection that his divine heritage provided, but that would not extend to his mortal friend. The conditions that Achilles established for Patroclus' use of the armour reflected both his tactical intelligence and his deep concern for his friend's safety. His instructions were specific and detailed, emphasizing defensive objectives rather than the kind of aggressive pursuit that might lead Patroclus into situations where his mortal abilities would prove inadequate against Trojan champions. The plan called for a limited engagement designed to drive Trojan forces back from the Greek ships, while avoiding the kind of extended combat that might expose the deception or place Patroclus in mortal danger. The process of arming Patroclus in Achilles' equipment was conducted with the ceremony appropriate to such a significant moment, as both friends understood the symbolic weight of what was occurring. The bronze greaves, crafted to fit Achilles' divine proportions, required adjustment to accommodate Patroclus' more mortal dimensions, while the corselet with its intricate decorations seemed to glow with inner light as it was fastened around his chest. The helmet, crowned with horsehair plumes that had become one of Achilles' most recognizable features, transformed Patroclus' appearance so completely that even close friends might have been deceived at a distance. The shield that Achilles placed upon Patroclus' arm represented perhaps the most significant element of the borrowed equipment, as its divine craftsmanship and symbolic decorations made it one of the most famous artifacts in the Greek army. The scenes depicted on its surface told the story of human civilization in miniature, from peaceful cities with their markets and festivals to the harsh realities of warfare and siege. The weight of the shield, manageable for Achilles through his supernatural strength, required Patroclus to adjust his fighting style to accommodate equipment that had not been designed for mortal limitations. The only piece of Achilles' equipment that Patroclus could not use was the massive ash spear that had been crafted specifically for the hero's divine enhanced abilities. The weapon's size and weight made it impossible for any mortal warrior to wield effectively, forcing Patroclus to rely on conventional spears that, while well crafted, lacked the supernatural properties that made Achilles' weapons so deadly. This limitation would prove significant in the combat that lay ahead, as it represented the fundamental difference between divine and mortal capabilities that no amount of borrowed equipment could bridge. The Myrmidons' reaction to seeing Patroclus armed in their leader's equipment revealed the extent to which Achilles' withdrawal had affected the morale and fighting spirit of his elite forces. These warriors had been trained specifically to complement their leader's supernatural abilities, and their period of enforced inactivity had left them eager for combat and frustrated by their inability to assist their struggling comrades. The sight of familiar armour, even worn by someone other than Achilles, rekindled their enthusiasm and provided the psychological boost necessary to restore their legendary fighting effectiveness. The transformation in Patroclus' bearing as he donned the divine armour was remarkable to witness, as the weight of Achilles' identity seemed to settle upon his shoulders along with the bronze equipment. His movements took on a more confident quality, while his voice carried new authority as he addressed the Myrmidon forces who would follow him into battle. The psychological impact of wearing legendary equipment appeared to enhance his natural leadership abilities, creating the kind of inspirational presence that could motivate warriors to extraordinary efforts. The tactical briefing that Patroclus conducted before leading the Myrmidons into combat demonstrated his thorough understanding of both the current situation and the specific capabilities of the forces under his command. His plan emphasized the mobility and aggressive tactics that had made the Myrmidons so effective during the siege's early phases, while acknowledging the limitations imposed by his own mortal abilities and the need to maintain the deception regarding his identity. The objectives were clearly defined and achievable, focusing on immediate tactical gains rather than the kind of sweeping victories that might require divine intervention to accomplish. The march of the Myrmidons toward the battle lines created a sensation throughout the Greek camp, as warriors who'd grown accustomed to fighting without their most elite forces suddenly saw the distinctive armour and disciplined formations that had become synonymous with victory. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, as men who had been fighting defensively with growing desperation suddenly found their confidence restored by the apparent return of their greatest champion. Shouts of encouragement and recognition followed the column as it moved toward the combat zone, while officers scrambled to coordinate their forces with the returning elite unit. The Trojan reaction to the appearance of what seemed to be Achilles returning to active combat was equally dramatic, though it manifested itself in fear rather than joy. Hector's forces, which had been pressing their advantage with growing confidence, suddenly found themselves facing an opponent whose reputation made victory seem impossible and survival uncertain. The sight of the distinctive armour and the disciplined advance of the Myrmidon forces created immediate confusion in Trojan ranks, as commanders struggled to adjust their tactics to meet a threat they had not anticipated. The initial phase of combat went exactly as Achilles had hoped, with Patroclus leading the Myrmidons in a carefully controlled assault that drove back Trojan forces, while avoiding the kind of extended engagement that might expose his true identity. His fighting style, while lacking Achilles' supernatural speed and strength, displayed the technical competence and tactical intelligence that had made him a respected warrior in his own right. The Myrmidons, inspired by their apparent leader's return and eager to prove their continued effectiveness, fought with the disciplined ferocity that had made them legendary throughout the Greek world. The success of the limited engagement began to affect Patroclus' judgment in ways that would prove fatal, as the psychological intoxication of wearing Achilles' armour and commanding the respect of both armies gradually overcame his natural caution. The ease with which Trojan forces had been driven back, combined with the obvious boost to Greek morale that his presence had provided, created a tempting opportunity to achieve more significant victories that might decisively shift the siege's momentum. The cheers of Greek warriors and the evident fear in Trojan ranks suggested that greater achievements might be possible if he were willing to press his advantage. The decision to pursue retreating Trojan forces beyond the limits that Achilles had established represented a tragic miscalculation that transformed a successful limited engagement into a disaster that would reshape the entire conflict. Patroclus' natural courage and his genuine desire to help his struggling comrades overcame the tactical wisdom that should have governed his actions, leading him to chase fleeing enemies toward Troy's walls, where the advantages of deception and surprise would be neutralized by close combat against opponents who would quickly recognize that they faced a mortal warrior rather than a divine champion. The fighting near Troy's walls exposed Patroclus to the kind of sustained combat that revealed the limitations of borrowed equipment and mortal abilities when facing opponents of Hector's caliber. The Trojan prince, initially confused by the apparent return of Achilles to active combat, quickly recognized through close observation that he faced a different opponent whose fighting style, while competent, lacked the supernatural elements that had made previous encounters with the Greek champion so dangerous. This recognition transformed Hector's tactical approach from cautious defense to aggressive offense, as he realized that he faced an opponent he could actually defeat. The intervention of Apollo at the crucial moment represented divine manipulation that ensured Patroclus's death while serving the broader cosmic purposes that the gods were pursuing through the Trojan conflict. The god's action in striking the divine armour from Patroclus's body left him vulnerable at precisely the moment when Hector's spear thrust would prove fatal, creating the appearance of natural combat while ensuring the outcome that would draw Achilles back into active participation. The loss of the protective equipment that had sustained the deception throughout the battle left Patroclus exposed not only to physical harm, but to the psychological shock of sudden recognition by enemies who now understood they had been deceived. The moment of Patroclus's death marked a turning point in the Trojan War that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hector's bronze spear, guided by divine will and driven by the Trojan prince's considerable skill, found its mark in the gap between corselet and helmet that the loss of divine protection had created. The wound was immediately fatal, ending the life of a warrior whose loyalty and courage had made him beloved throughout the Greek forces, while setting in motion the chain of events that would ultimately determine Troy's fate. The stripping of Achilles' armour from Patroclus's body became a symbolic victory that Hector and his followers pursued with an intensity that reflected their understanding of its significance. The divine equipment represented not only valuable spoils of war, but also a psychological prize that could demonstrate Trojan superiority over their greatest enemy. The fierce fighting that erupted around Patroclus's fallen form involved some of the war's most notable heroes, as both sides recognized that control of the body and its equipment would have implications extending far beyond the immediate battle. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles through Antilochus, son of Nestor, whose grim expression and obvious distress conveyed the magnitude of the disaster before any words were spoken. The messenger's account of the battle's progression, from initial success through tragic overreach to final catastrophe, provided Achilles with a detailed understanding of how his closest friend had died while wearing his armour and leading his men. The report emphasized both Patroclus's heroic conduct and the divine intervention that had ensured his defeat, creating a narrative that combined human tragedy with cosmic manipulation. Achilles' immediate reaction to the news transcended normal expressions of grief, as his divine heritage intensified emotions that would have overwhelmed ordinary mortals. His anguish manifested itself in physical actions that demonstrated the supernatural strength that his anger could unleash, as he tore his golden hair and threw himself upon the ground with force that would have injured lesser men. The sounds of his mourning, described by witnesses as more terrible than the roar of lions or the crash of thunder, carried across the Greek camp and alerted everyone to the magnitude of what had occurred. The transformation that grief worked upon Achilles was immediately apparent to those who witnessed his reaction, as the proud, aloof hero who had maintained his withdrawal from combat, despite all appeals, was replaced by a figure of terrible purpose whose only thought was vengeance against those responsible for his friend's death. His divine fire, which had previously been directed toward achieving personal glory and eternal fame, now focused entirely on the destruction of Hector and anyone else who had participated in Patroclus's killing. The change was so complete that even his physical appearance seemed altered, with his golden features taking on a harsh, implacable quality that promised retribution beyond normal human capabilities. Thetis's arrival at her son's tent to comfort him in his grief provided an opportunity for divine counsel that would shape the remainder of Achilles' brief life. The sea nymph's supernatural perception allowed her to understand immediately that her son's anguish had transformed him in ways that made his previous withdrawal from combat impossible to maintain. Her attempts to console him were tempered by her knowledge of the prophecies that governed his fate, particularly the prediction that his own death would follow soon after Hector's, making any return to active combat a step toward the fulfillment of his tragic destiny. The promise of new armour to replace the equipment lost with Patroclus represented more than simple material compensation, as Thetis understood that her son would need divine protection for the battles that lay ahead. Her journey to Hephaestus' forge beneath Mount Etna was undertaken with the urgency of a mother seeking to protect her child, even though she knew that the armour she commissioned would ultimately serve to fulfill rather than prevent the prophecy of his early death. The divine smith's agreement to craft new equipment reflected both his respect for Thetis and his understanding of the cosmic forces that were driving the conflict toward its predetermined conclusion. The reconciliation between Achilles and Agamemnon, when it finally occurred, was driven by practical necessity rather than genuine forgiveness, as both leaders recognized that their personal dispute had become irrelevant in the face of larger events. Achilles' grief and rage had burned away the pride and wounded feelings that had sustained his withdrawal, leaving only the focused purpose of avenging Patroclus' death. Agamemnon's willingness to make amends reflected his recognition that the expedition's survival depended on restoring their greatest warrior to active service, regardless of the personal costs involved in admitting his previous errors. The formal ceremony that marked the end of their dispute included the return of Briseis and the delivery of all the gifts that had been offered during the failed embassy, though these gestures held little meaning for Achilles in his current state. His focus had narrowed to the single objective of facing Hector in combat, making material rewards and political reconciliation seem trivial compared to the opportunity for vengeance that drove his every thought. The restoration of his status within the Greek hierarchy was accepted as a necessary step toward achieving his true goal, rather than as a satisfying resolution to their conflict. The arrival of the new armour crafted by Hephaestus created a sensation throughout the Greek camp, as warriors gathered to witness equipment whose divine craftsmanship surpassed even the legendary pieces that had been lost with Patroclus. The shield in particular displayed artistic and technical mastery that seemed to capture the entire cosmos in miniature, with scenes that appeared to move and change as viewers observed them from different angles. The bronze seemed to glow within a fire, while the decorative elements incorporated metals and techniques that no mortal smith could duplicate. The divine armour that Hephaestus had forged for Achilles transformed the young hero into something beyond mortal comprehension, as the bronze plates seemed to channel his supernatural rage into visible manifestations of divine wrath. When he strode onto the battlefield seeking Hector, the very ground trembled beneath his feet, while his war cry echoed across the Trojan plain with such force that horses reared in terror and seasoned warriors felt their courage falter. The Myrmidons who followed him moved with the disciplined precision of men who understood they were witnessing the final act of their leader's legendary career, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming in formation as they prepared to support Achilles in his quest for vengeance. The confrontation between the two greatest champions of their respective armies had been inevitable since the siege began, but Patroclus' death had transformed what might have been a contest between equals into something far more terrible. Achilles no longer fought for glory or honour in the traditional sense, but rather as an instrument of divine retribution, whose only purpose was to inflict upon Hector the kind of suffering that matched his own grief. His supernatural speed, enhanced by his burning desire for revenge, allowed him to cover ground with inhuman swiftness as he pursued the Trojan prince through the streets and around the walls of the great city. Hector's initial attempt to avoid single combat with Achilles demonstrated tactical wisdom rather than cowardice, as the Trojan prince understood that his opponent's current state made victory virtually impossible through conventional means. The divine armour that protected Achilles, combined with his supernatural abilities and overwhelming rage, created a combination that no mortal warrior could reasonably expect to overcome. Hector's flight around Troy's walls was a calculated attempt to exhaust his opponent's fury, while seeking divine intervention or tactical advantages that might level the playing field between them. The 3 circuits of Troy's massive fortifications that preceded their final confrontation allowed both armies to witness the full extent of Achilles' transformation from grieving friend to implacable destroyer. His pursuit never wavered despite the distance covered, while his bronze armour seemed to burn within a fire that reflected the intensity of his emotions. The sight of their greatest defender being chased by an apparently superhuman opponent had a devastating effect on Trojan morale, as civilians and soldiers alike watched from the walls and understood that they were witnessing events that would determine their city's ultimate fate. When Hector finally turned to face his pursuer, the Trojan prince displayed the courage and dignity that had made him beloved throughout his city, and respected even by his enemies. His bronze armour, while expertly crafted by the finest smiths in Troy, appeared almost crude when compared to the divine equipment that Achilles wore. Yet Hector's bearing remained proud and determined, as he prepared to face an opponent whose abilities transcended mortal limitations. His final words to his family, spoken from the walls where they watched in anguish, revealed the depth of his love for those he protected and his understanding of what his death would mean for Troy's future. The actual combat between the 2 champions was briefer and more one-sided than the epic nature of their confrontation might have suggested, as Achilles' divine advantages proved overwhelming when combined with his supernatural rage. Hector's considerable skill and experience allowed him to survive the initial exchanges, but his mortal limitations became increasingly apparent as Achilles' relentless assault continued without any sign of fatigue or diminishing intensity. The Trojan prince's bronze spear, while accurately thrown and powerfully delivered, could not penetrate the divine armour that protected his opponent, while Achilles' own weapon found the single vulnerable point in Hector's equipment with deadly precision. The moment of Hector's death marked not only the end of Troy's greatest defender, but also the beginning of actions that would violate the most fundamental codes of heroic conduct that governed Bronze Age warfare. Achilles' treatment of his fallen opponent's body reflected the extent to which grief and rage had consumed his humanity, transforming a hero whose previous conduct had been exemplary into something that horrified both armies. The stripping of Hector's armour followed traditional practices, but the subsequent desecration of the corpse represented a departure from accepted norms that shocked even hardened warriors accustomed to the brutalities of siege warfare. The binding of Hector's body to Achilles' chariot and its subsequent dragging around the walls of Troy created a spectacle of vengeance that served no tactical purpose, but satisfied the young hero's need to inflict humiliation upon his enemy even in death. The sight of their beloved prince's corpse being defiled before their eyes had a devastating psychological impact on Troy's defenders, while the sound of his bronze armour scraping against stones as the chariot circled the city created an auditory reminder of their loss that penetrated every corner of the great fortress. The violation of traditional burial customs, which held sacred significance in Bronze Age religious beliefs, added spiritual horror to the physical brutality of the scene. The Greek army's reaction to Achilles' behaviour revealed the complex emotions that his actions generated among warriors who understood both his grief and the excessive nature of his revenge. Many veterans who had served throughout the siege recognized that Hector's death represented a crucial victory that significantly improved their prospects for ultimate success, yet they were disturbed by the manner in which their champion was dishonouring a fallen opponent who had fought with courage and dignity. The younger warriors, inspired by Achilles' supernatural prowess and his successful vengeance for Patroclus, were more inclined to celebrate the victory without questioning the methods employed to achieve it. For 11 days, Achilles continued his ritual desecration of Hector's body, driving his chariot around Patroclus's funeral pyre each morning while dragging the Trojan prince's corpse behind him. The repetitive nature of this behaviour demonstrated how completely grief had consumed his rational faculties, transforming actions that might have been understandable in the immediate aftermath of combat into an obsessive ritual that served no purpose beyond the expression of uncontrolled emotion. The divine protection that Apollo provided to preserve Hector's body from corruption prevented the complete physical destruction that Achilles sought, creating a supernatural intervention that maintained the corpse's dignity despite the ongoing abuse. The funeral of Patroclus, conducted with elaborate ceremonies that befitted a hero of his stature, provided a temporary focus for Achilles' grief that allowed him to channel his emotions into more constructive activities. The massive pyre, constructed from timber gathered throughout the Trojan countryside, created a monument to their friendship that was visible from Troy's walls and served as a reminder of the personal cost that the war had exacted from both sides. The sacrificial offerings that accompanied the cremation, including captured Trojan nobles and valuable possessions, reflected the extent of Achilles' loss and his determination to honour his friend's memory through displays of wealth and power. The athletic games held in Patroclus' honour followed traditional practices for commemorating fallen heroes, though the participation of the Greek army's greatest champions gave these particular contests special significance. Achilles' role as organiser and judge of the competitions demonstrated his gradual return to more normal patterns of behaviour, as the structured nature of the games provided an outlet for competitive instincts that had been consumed by grief and rage. The valuable prizes offered to winners reflected both his personal wealth and his desire to create a fitting memorial to his friend's life and achievements. The intervention of King Priam represented one of the most remarkable acts of courage and paternal love recorded in Bronze Age literature, as the elderly monarch risked his life to enter the Greek camp and plead for the return of his son's body. The journey from Troy to Achilles' tent required not only physical bravery, but also the kind of moral courage that allowed Priam to humble himself before the man who had killed his greatest son and heir. His decision to travel under cover of darkness, accompanied only by a single herald and guided by divine protection, demonstrated the desperate love of a father whose grief matched that of his son's killer. Priam's approach to Achilles' tent was facilitated by Hermes, who had been sent by Zeus to ensure the success of a mission that would serve broader divine purposes while providing an opportunity for both men to find some measure of peace. The god's guidance allowed the Trojan king to pass through Greek sentries without detection, while his divine protection ensured that Priam would be able to present his case without immediate violence from guards who might have killed him on sight. The supernatural assistance reflected the god's recognition that the continued desecration of Hector's body was disrupting the cosmic order and required resolution through mortal action. The encounter between Priam and Achilles in the hero's tent created a moment of shared humanity that transcended the bitter divisions of warfare and personal vengeance. The elderly king's willingness to kiss the hands that had killed his son demonstrated a level of humility and desperation that penetrated even Achilles' rage-consumed consciousness, while his eloquent plea for mercy appealed to whatever remained of the young hero's better nature. The sight of a father's grief, so similar to his own mourning for Patroclus, created an emotional connection that allowed Achilles to recognize their common suffering despite their positions as enemies. Priam's speech to Achilles combined personal appeals with broader considerations of honor and divine will, as the Trojan king understood that his success depended on finding arguments that would resonate with his audience's values and beliefs. His references to Achilles' own father, Peleus, created emotional parallels that highlighted the universal nature of paternal love and the grief that accompanied the loss of beloved children. The king's willingness to offer substantial ransom for Hector's body, while important as a gesture of respect, was less significant than his demonstration of the courage and dignity that had made his son such a formidable opponent. The transformation in Achilles during his conversation with Priam revealed the extent to which his humanity had been preserved, despite the consuming nature of his grief and rage. The young hero's recognition of their shared suffering created an opportunity for the kind of mercy and understanding that had seemed impossible during the previous weeks of desecration and ritual humiliation. His agreement to return Hector's body reflected not weakness or defeat, but rather a return to the heroic values that had originally motivated his participation in the war and his pursuit of eternal fame through noble deeds. The practical arrangements for Hector's return required careful coordination to prevent violence between forces that had been locked in deadly combat for nearly a decade. The truce that Achilles granted to allow for proper funeral rites demonstrated his understanding that certain obligations transcended the immediate demands of warfare, while his promise of safe passage for Trojan funeral processions showed respect for the religious customs that both sides held sacred. The temporary cessation of hostilities created an opportunity for both armies to tend to their wounded, repair equipment, and rest from the constant strain of siege warfare. The funeral of Hector became a citywide expression of grief that demonstrated the extent to which Troy's greatest defender had been beloved by his people. The elaborate ceremonies, conducted with all the dignity that Trojan religious traditions required, served multiple purposes beyond simple mourning for the dead. The public display of grief and respect provided emotional release for civilians who had watched helplessly as their champion was humiliated, while the formal recognition of Hector's achievements reinforced the values and ideals that continued to motivate Troy's resistance against Greek invasion. The construction of Hector's funeral pyre followed ancient customs that reflected both royal status and heroic achievement, with timber gathered from throughout Troy's territory and aromatic woods imported from distant lands to create a monument worthy of the city's greatest son. The placement of the pyre within Troy's walls, visible to both defenders and besiegers, created a powerful symbol of the city's determination to honour its heroes despite the ongoing siege. The valuable grave goods placed with Hector's body, including weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects, demonstrated the wealth and cultural sophistication that the Greeks sought to capture through their conquest of the city. The participation of Troy's allies in Hector's funeral ceremonies revealed the extent to which the prince's reputation had spread throughout Asia Minor and the personal loyalty he had inspired among foreign warriors who had come to support Priam's cause. Representatives from kingdoms throughout the region brought tribute and condolences that testified to Hector's diplomatic achievements as well as his military prowess, while their presence reinforced Troy's position as the leader of a broader coalition opposing Greek expansion. The international character of the funeral proceedings demonstrated that Hector's death was mourned not only by his immediate subjects but by peoples throughout the eastern Mediterranean who had benefited from his leadership and protection. The temporary truce that accompanied Hector's funeral provided both sides with opportunities to assess their positions and plan for the continuation of hostilities that would inevitably resume once the mourning period ended. Greek commanders used the respite to address logistical challenges that had been accumulating throughout the siege, while Trojan leaders worked to reorganize their defenses and coordinate with allies whose continued support would be essential for the city's survival. The brief peace served as a reminder of what normal life might be like without the constant threat of violence, though both armies understood that the fundamental issues driving the conflict remained unresolved. During this period of mourning and reflection, messengers arrived in Troy bearing news that would provide the city with renewed hope for successful resistance against the Greek invasion. The reports described the approach of powerful new allies whose reputations for military excellence rivaled those of the heroes already engaged in the siege, offering the possibility that Hector's death might be avenged and Troy's fortunes restored through the intervention of fresh forces. The timing of these arrivals, so soon after the loss of their greatest defender, seemed to many Trojans to represent divine favour that rewarded their faithful mourning of their fallen champion. The first of these new allies was Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, whose reputation as a warrior had spread throughout the ancient world despite the remote location of her kingdom. The Amazons represented a unique military tradition that challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles in warfare, as these women had developed fighting techniques and social structures that allowed them to compete successfully with male-dominated armies throughout their region. Penthesilea's decision to bring her forces to Troy's aid reflected both political calculations about the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and personal motivations related to her own quest for heroic achievement and eternal fame. The Amazon Queen's arrival at Troy created a sensation among both defenders and besiegers, as her exotic appearance and unconventional military methods provided a stark contrast to the traditional warfare that had characterized the siege's previous phases. Her bronze armor, crafted in styles unknown to either Greek or Trojan smiths, incorporated design elements that emphasized mobility and flexibility rather than the heavy protection favored by male warriors of the period. Her weapons, including a distinctive double-headed axe and a powerful composite bow, reflected the specialized training that had made Amazon warriors legendary throughout Asia Minor and beyond. Penthesilea's forces, numbering approximately 1,000 elite warriors, brought tactical capabilities that complemented Troy's existing strengths, while addressing some of the weaknesses that Hector's death had created in the city's defensive arrangements. The Amazons' expertise in mounted combat provided Troy with enhanced mobility that could be used to harass Greek supply lines and conduct rapid strikes against vulnerable positions. Their archery skills, developed through generations of hunting and warfare on the steppes, offered long-range capabilities that could inflict casualties on Greek forces while remaining beyond the reach of conventional infantry weapons. The psychological impact of the Amazons' arrival extended beyond their immediate military contributions to affect the morale and confidence of both armies in significant ways. For Troy's defenders, the sight of fresh forces led by a warrior queen whose reputation matched those of the greatest male heroes provided renewed hope that the city could survive the loss of Hector and continue its resistance against Greek invasion. The exotic nature of the Amazon warriors, combined with their obvious competence and discipline, suggested that Troy's cause enjoyed support from peoples and traditions that the Greeks had not previously encountered. The Greek reaction to Penthesilea's arrival revealed both tactical concerns about facing unfamiliar opponents and cultural discomfort with the concept of women as warriors. Many Greek commanders had heard stories of Amazon military prowess, but had dismissed them as exaggerations or myths, making the reality of facing such opponents a disturbing challenge to their assumptions about the natural order of warfare. The need to develop new tactical approaches for dealing with mounted archers and unconventional weapons required adjustments to Greek military doctrine that had been refined through generations of traditional infantry combat. The second major reinforcement for Troy came from a completely different direction, as Memnon of Ethiopia arrived with forces that represented the military traditions of Africa and the Upper Nile region. The Ethiopian prince, son of the dawn goddess Eos, brought divine heritage that rivaled Achilles' own supernatural advantages, while his reputation for personal combat prowess and strategic intelligence made him a potentially decisive addition to Troy's cause. His decision to support Priam reflected both diplomatic considerations related to trade relationships and personal motivations connected to his own pursuit of heroic fame. Memnon's appearance provided a striking contrast to the other heroes engaged in the siege, as his dark skin and distinctive equipment marked him as a representative of civilizations that most Greeks and Trojans knew only through distant trade relationships. His bronze armor incorporated design elements from multiple traditions, combining the protective capabilities valued by Mediterranean warriors with decorative motifs that reflected the artistic achievements of his homeland. His weapons, including spears tipped with specially hardened bronze and a sword whose blade showed patterns unknown to Greek or Trojan smiths, demonstrated the technical sophistication of Ethiopian metallurgy. The Ethiopian forces that accompanied Memnon numbered approximately 1,500 warriors whose training and equipment reflected military traditions that had developed independently of those familiar to the siege's previous participants. Their tactical methods emphasized coordinated infantry movements supported by specialized units of archers and slingers whose accuracy had been developed through constant warfare against neighboring kingdoms. The distinctive shields carried by Ethiopian warriors, decorated with geometric patterns and reinforced with bronze studs, provided excellent protection while allowing for the mobility necessary for their preferred fighting styles. The arrival of these new allies transformed the strategic situation facing both armies, as Troy's defensive capabilities were significantly enhanced, while Greek commanders found themselves confronting opponents whose methods and capabilities were largely unknown to them. The psychological impact of facing fresh forces led by legendary warriors created challenges for Greek morale that had been building throughout the siege's later phases, while the tactical complexities introduced by unfamiliar fighting styles required adaptations to established military doctrines. The stage was now set for confrontations that would test the limits of heroic achievement, while determining whether Troy's new defenders could succeed where Hector had ultimately failed. The arrival of Penthesilea and Memnon had briefly rekindled hope within Troy's walls, but even these legendary reinforcements could not alter the fundamental trajectory of a war that had consumed nearly a decade of human life and divine attention. The Amazon Queen's fierce assault on the Greek lines demonstrated the tactical innovations that her warriors brought to Troy's defence, as their mounted archery and unconventional weapons created initial confusion among Greek forces accustomed to traditional infantry combat. However, her confrontation with Achilles revealed the insurmountable gap between mortal excellence and divine enhanced abilities, as the young hero's supernatural speed and strength proved decisive in single combat that ended with Penthesilea's death and the demoralization of her surviving followers. Memnon's challenge to Achilles created the war's most evenly matched duel between champions of comparable divine heritage, as the Ethiopian prince's supernatural abilities and combat experience provided a genuine test of the Greek hero's supremacy. Their battle raged across the Trojan plain for hours, with neither warrior able to gain decisive advantage through conventional means, while both armies watched in fascination as bronze weapons clashed with forces that bent and shattered ordinary equipment. The intervention of the fates ultimately determined the outcome, as Achilles' destiny to achieve immortal fame through early death proved stronger than Memnon's own heroic aspirations, leading to the Ethiopian prince's defeat and the collapse of Troy's last hope for external salvation. The death of these final champions marked a turning point in Achilles' own fate, as the young hero's string of victories had fulfilled the prophecies that governed his brief life while bringing him ever closer to his predetermined doom. His divine mother Thetis had warned him repeatedly that his own death would follow soon after his greatest triumphs, yet the intoxication of supernatural success and the satisfaction of avenging Patroclus had made him increasingly reckless in his pursuit of glory. The pattern of his behaviour suggested a warrior who understood his approaching end, but remained determined to achieve the maximum possible fame before his inevitable fall. The circumstances of Achilles' death came not through heroic single combat with an equal opponent, but through the intervention of divine forces that had been building throughout the siege's duration. Paris, guided by Apollo's supernatural assistance, succeeded in striking the Greek hero's vulnerable heel with an arrow that carried both mortal bronze and immortal purpose. The shot itself required no exceptional skill, as the god's guidance ensured accuracy while the arrow's divine enhancement penetrated the supernatural protection that had preserved Achilles throughout his career. The irony of the greatest warrior of his generation falling to Troy's least martial prince, aided by divine intervention, reflected the complex relationship between fate, skill, and supernatural influence that had characterized the entire conflict. The immediate aftermath of Achilles' death created chaos within the Greek ranks, as warriors who had depended on his invincibility suddenly found themselves facing the reality of mortality that their champion had seemed to transcend. The psychological impact was devastating, as men who had followed him into seemingly impossible situations now questioned their ability to continue the siege without his supernatural leadership. The Myrmidons in particular were overwhelmed by grief and rage that threatened to destroy their effectiveness as a fighting force, while other contingents began to discuss the possibility of abandoning the expedition and returning to Greece with whatever spoils they had already accumulated. The struggle over Achilles' body became one of the war's most desperate battles, as both sides recognized the symbolic importance of controlling the fallen hero's remains. Ajax the Greater and Odysseus led the Greek effort to recover their champion's corpse, fighting with desperate courage against Trojan forces who understood that capturing Achilles' body would provide enormous psychological advantages while potentially breaking Greek morale entirely. The combat raged for hours around the fallen hero, with some of the war's most notable figures risking their lives to either claim or protect the supernatural warrior whose death had shocked both armies. The eventual Greek success in recovering Achilles' body allowed for funeral ceremonies that befitted the greatest hero of his generation, though the elaborate rituals could not disguise the expedition's increasingly precarious position. The massive pyre constructed for his cremation consumed timber gathered from throughout the Trojan countryside, while the valuable grave goods placed with his remains included weapons and treasures that represented the accumulated wealth of nearly a decade of warfare. The athletic games held in his honour attracted participation from heroes throughout the Greek coalition, though the competitions lacked the celebratory atmosphere that had characterized earlier such events. The dispute over Achilles' divine armour created additional tensions within the Greek leadership at a time when unity was essential for the expedition's survival. The competition between Ajax the Greater and Odysseus for the right to inherit the legendary equipment reflected deeper disagreements about leadership and strategy that had been building throughout the siege. Ajax's claim was based on his reputation for courage and his role in recovering Achilles' body, while Odysseus argued that intelligence and strategic thinking were more valuable than simple physical prowess in the challenges that lay ahead. The decision to award the armour to Odysseus, made by a council of Greek leaders who valued his diplomatic and tactical skills, had tragic consequences that further weakened the coalition at a critical moment. Ajax's humiliation at being passed over for recognition drove him to a madness that culminated in his suicide, depriving the Greeks of another irreplaceable champion, while demonstrating the psychological toll that prolonged warfare had exacted on even the strongest personalities. The loss of both Achilles and Ajax within a short period forced Greek commanders to confront the reality that their greatest heroes were mortal and replaceable, despite their legendary reputations. With their most effective champions dead or demoralized, Greek leaders finally acknowledged that traditional siege tactics would never succeed against Troy's massive fortifications and determined defenders. The city's walls, constructed by divine hands and maintained through generations of careful engineering, had proven impervious to direct assault despite years of attempts by the world's greatest warriors. The realization that brute force would not achieve victory forced a fundamental reassessment of Greek strategy that would ultimately lead to the adoption of methods that emphasized deception rather than heroic combat. Odysseus emerged as the primary architect of the new approach, as his reputation for cunning and strategic innovation made him the logical choice to devise alternatives to the failed frontal assaults that had characterized the siege's previous phases. His analysis of the tactical situation emphasized Troy's dependence on the psychological security provided by their impregnable walls, suggesting that success might be achieved through methods that bypassed these defenses entirely. The concept that would become known as the Trojan horse represented a radical departure from traditional Bronze Age warfare, requiring careful planning and flawless execution to succeed where conventional tactics had failed. The construction of the massive wooden horse required the combined skills of the Greek expedition's finest carpenters and engineers, working under conditions of extreme secrecy to avoid detection by Trojan scouts who monitored Greek activities from the city's watchtowers. The structure itself was a masterpiece of Bronze Age craftsmanship, large enough to conceal a substantial force of elite warriors while appearing to be a religious offering suitable for dedication to the gods. The hollow interior was carefully designed to provide adequate space and ventilation for the hidden soldiers, while the external appearance incorporated decorative elements that would appeal to Trojan religious sensibilities. The selection of warriors to hide within the horse required careful consideration of both combat effectiveness and psychological stability, as the men chosen would need to remain motionless and silent for extended periods while surrounded by enemy forces. Odysseus personally led this elite group, which included some of the expedition's most reliable veterans, along with younger warriors whose courage had been proven through years of siege warfare. The total number of hidden soldiers, approximately 30 according to most accounts, represented a compromise between the need for sufficient force to accomplish their mission and the practical limitations imposed by the horse's internal capacity. The deception that accompanied the horse's deployment required elaborate preparation to convince Trojan observers that the Greek expedition had abandoned the siege and departed for home. The systematic destruction of the camp's permanent structures, combined with the departure of most ships under cover of darkness, created the appearance of a defeated army retreating after years of unsuccessful efforts. The few Greeks who remained behind, led by Sinon, were tasked with maintaining the illusion while providing the final elements of deception that would persuade Troy's defenders to bring the horse within their walls. Sinon's performance as a supposed deserter, who had been abandoned by his departing comrades, represented one of the most sophisticated deceptions in Bronze Age warfare, as his story needed to explain both the horse's presence and his own survival in enemy territory. His account of Greek desperation and divine displeasure provided explanations that resonated with Trojan religious beliefs, while offering them the psychological satisfaction of believing they had achieved victory through their steadfast resistance. The physical evidence of his apparent mistreatment by his own forces, carefully orchestrated to support his story, convinced even skeptical Trojan interrogators that his information was genuine. The debate within Troy's leadership about whether to accept the horse revealed the internal divisions that years of siege warfare had created among the city's defenders. Conservative voices led by Laocoon and other experienced military commanders argued that any gift from the Greeks should be viewed with extreme suspicion regardless of its apparent religious significance. Their warnings about potential deception reflected the tactical wisdom gained through years of combating Greek cunning, while their religious concerns about accepting offerings from enemies demonstrated their understanding of the spiritual dimensions of warfare. The opposing faction, influenced by war weariness and the desperate desire to believe that their suffering had finally ended, interpreted the horse as evidence of divine favour that had finally turned against the Greek invaders. Their arguments emphasized the apparent authenticity of Sinon's story and the visible evidence of Greek departure, while dismissing warnings about deception as excessive caution that failed to recognize the changed circumstances. The psychological appeal of believing that victory had been achieved through their own steadfast resistance proved stronger than tactical prudence in the final decision-making process. The supernatural intervention that sealed Troy's fate came through the silencing of Cassandra, whose prophetic warnings about the horse's true nature were dismissed as the ravings of a mad woman cursed never to be believed. Her accurate perception of the hidden danger, combined with her inability to convince others of its reality, represented the tragic culmination of Apollo's punishment for her rejection of his advances years earlier. The god's curse ensured that Troy's most accurate prophet would be ignored at the moment when her warnings were most desperately needed. The destruction of Laocoon and his sons by sea serpents sent by Athena eliminated the most vocal opposition to accepting the horse, while providing apparent divine confirmation that the Greeks' offering should be welcomed rather than feared. The horrific death of the priest who had warned against trusting Greek gifts created a powerful demonstration of divine displeasure that silenced other potential objectors, while reinforcing the arguments of those who favoured bringing the horse into the city. The timing and manner of this intervention left no doubt about divine intentions in the minds of Trojan observers. The procession that brought the horse through Troy's gates represented a celebration of apparent victory that involved the entire population in welcoming what they believed to be evidence of their successful resistance. The massive gates which had protected the city throughout the siege were opened wide to accommodate the enormous wooden structure, while citizens lined the streets to witness the arrival of what they interpreted as a trophy of their triumph over Greek aggression. The religious ceremonies that accompanied the horse's placement within the city demonstrated the spiritual significance that Trojans attached to their apparent victory. The night of Troy's fall began with celebrations that reflected the population's relief at the apparent end of their ordeal, as wine flowed freely and citizens gathered in the streets to share their joy at having survived the greatest military challenge in their history. The festivals that erupted throughout the city created the perfect conditions for the Greek deception to succeed, as the noise and confusion of celebration masked the sounds of the hidden warriors emerging from their wooden concealment. The guards who should have maintained vigilance during this crucial period were either participating in the festivities or dulled by wine and exhaustion from years of constant alertness. The signal fires that Sinon lit to guide the returning Greek fleet provided the final element of coordination necessary for the plan's success, as the main Greek force had been waiting on the nearby island of Tenedos for confirmation that the deception had succeeded. The ships that had departed so conspicuously returned under cover of darkness, carrying the bulk of the Greek army back to the beaches they had occupied for nearly a decade. The timing of their arrival, coordinated with the emergence of the hidden warriors, ensured that Troy's defenders would face simultaneous attacks from both internal and external forces. The opening of Troy's gates from within eliminated the primary advantage that had protected the city throughout the siege, as the massive fortifications became irrelevant once Greek forces gained access to the interior. The warriors who'd hidden within the horse moved with practiced efficiency to secure key positions and eliminate guards before organised resistance could develop, while their signal fires guided the main Greek force to the most vulnerable entry points. The speed and coordination of these initial actions prevented Trojan defenders from mounting the kind of organised resistance that might have repelled the attack despite the element of surprise. The sack of Troy that followed represented the culmination of nearly a decade of accumulated rage and frustration, as Greek warriors who had suffered through years of siege warfare finally gained access to the wealth and women that had motivated their long campaign. The systematic destruction that engulfed the city reflected not only the practical necessities of eliminating resistance, but also the emotional release of men who had endured enormous hardships in pursuit of victory. The flames that consumed Troy's palaces and temples created a glow that was visible for miles, announcing to the ancient world that one of its greatest cities had finally fallen. The massacre of Troy's royal family eliminated the leadership that might have organised continued resistance, while fulfilling the brutal logic of Bronze Age warfare that required the complete destruction of enemy dynasties. King Priam's death at the altar of Zeus, where he had sought sanctuary, demonstrated the extent to which traditional religious protections had been abandoned in the fury of conquest. The systematic killing of male members of the royal line, including the infant Astyanax, whose very existence represented a potential threat to Greek security, reflected the calculated brutality that characterized ancient warfare. Hector's widow Andromache and Helen herself became symbols of Troy's transformation from proud city to Greek possession, as their capture and enslavement demonstrated the complete reversal of fortune that military defeat could bring. Andromache's fate, assigned to Neoptolemus as his prize, represented the particular tragedy of noble women whose lives were destroyed by conflicts they had not chosen. Helen's return to Menelaus, the original cause of the entire war, provided a sense of completion to the Greek narrative while raising questions about whether such enormous costs had been justified by the recovery of a single woman. The desecration of Troy's temples during the sack created divine anger that would plague the Greek victors during their attempts to return home, as their violations of sacred spaces and their mistreatment of suppliants who had sought divine protection offended gods who had previously supported their cause. The rape of Cassandra, Athena's altar by Ajax the Lesser, represented the most egregious example of such sacrilege, earning divine wrath that would manifest itself in storms and disasters that scattered the Greek fleet and prevented many heroes from ever reaching their homes. The distribution of spoils among the Greek leaders reflected both the enormous wealth that Troy had accumulated through generations of trade and the complex political relationships that had sustained the coalition throughout the siege. The golden treasures, fine textiles, and skilled craftsmen that were divided among the victorious kings provided material compensation for their years of investment in the expedition, while demonstrating the economic motivations that had always underlain the conflict's heroic narrative. The assignment of Trojan women as prizes followed established customs while creating the personal relationships that would influence Greek politics for generations. Some Trojan survivors managed to escape the city's destruction, carrying with them the cultural traditions and religious practices that would eventually establish new centres of Trojan civilization in distant lands. Aeneas, protected by his divine mother Aphrodite, led a group of refugees who would eventually reach Italy and establish the foundations of what would become Roman civilization. His successful escape with his father Anchises and son Ascanius preserved the Trojan royal line while ensuring that Troy's cultural legacy would survive despite the city's physical destruction. The scattered returns of the Greek heroes marked the beginning of troubles that would claim many lives and destroy several kingdoms as divine anger over the sack successes manifested itself in supernatural opposition to their homeward journeys. Agamemnon's murder by his wife Clytemnestra, seeking a revenge for Iphigenia's sacrifice, demonstrated that the war's costs extended far beyond the battlefield to affect families and kingdoms throughout the Greek world. The curse that followed the house of Atreus ensured that the victor's fruits would be poisoned by the methods used to achieve them. Odysseus's 10-year journey home became the most famous example of divine punishment for the sack successes, as his wanderings through supernatural dangers and exotic lands reflected the cosmic displeasure that his cunning had ultimately provoked. His eventual return to Ithaca, while successful, came only after enormous suffering that demonstrated the price of defying divine will through excessive cleverness. The transformation of the war's greatest strategist into a wandering exile illustrated the broader theme that victory in the Trojan War brought as many curses as blessings to its Greek architects. The fall of Troy marked the end of the Bronze Age heroic tradition that had produced warriors like Achilles, Hector, and Ajax, whose individual prowess had dominated battlefields and inspired generations of later heroes. The success of Odysseus's deceptive strategy over traditional heroic combat represented a fundamental shift toward methods that emphasized intelligence over strength, cunning over courage, and collective action over individual achievement. The wooden horse became a symbol of this transformation, representing the triumph of human ingenuity over both divine protection and heroic excellence. The destruction of Troy also eliminated one of the Bronze Age world's most important commercial centres, disrupting trade networks that had connected Europe and Asia for generations, while redistributing wealth and power throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The city's fall removed a crucial link in the economic systems that had sustained Bronze Age civilization, contributing to the broader collapse of palace-centered societies that would characterize the transition to the Iron Age. The Greek victory, while complete in military terms, ultimately contributed to the destruction of the very civilization it sought to dominate. The war's end brought no lasting peace to the Greek world, as the returning heroes found their kingdoms weakened by years of absence and their authority challenged by rivals who had remained at home. The political instability that followed the expedition's return contributed to the broader pattern of collapse that would end Mycenaean civilization within a generation of Troy's fall. The irony that the war's victors would themselves become victims of historical change demonstrated the ultimate futility of conflicts that consumed entire civilizations in pursuit of temporary advantages. The stories of the Trojan War, preserved in oral tradition and eventually recorded in written form, became the foundation myths of Greek civilization and provided models of heroic behaviour that influenced Western culture for millennia. The transformation of historical events into legendary narratives ensured that the war's participants achieved the immortal fame they had sought, though often in forms that emphasised their flaws and failures as much as their achievements. The enduring power of these stories reflected their ability to capture universal themes of love, honour, revenge, and the tragic consequences of human pride and divine intervention. Thus ended the Trojan War, and with it the age of heroes whose individual prowess had shaped the destiny of nations and whose personal conflicts had drawn the gods themselves into mortal affairs. The bronze weapons that had clashed on the plains of Troy were gradually replaced by iron tools that democratized warfare and reduced the importance of individual champions, while the palace-centered societies that had produced such legendary figures gave way to new forms of political organization that emphasized collective rather than heroic leadership. The fall of Troy marked not only the end of a great city, but the conclusion of an entire epoch in human history, as the Bronze Age heroic world gave way to new realities that would define the classical civilizations of antiquity.